The 2024 F1 season was a wild ride, and I don't think anybody could have expected how it turned out after the first 4 races of Max Verstappen dominance. So here's a compilation of every video that I made after each race this season, so you can watch how it unfolded in real time. And for those of you who already watched all these videos, there's even a little bonus one in there that I didn't release during the season because I made it after YouTube demonetized my channel for repetitive content, and I planned to release it after the next time Verstappen had a dominant victory. And then he just didn't. So buckle up, here's all 24 episodes of Race Weekend Update 2024. I woke up this morning ready to watch the Bahrain Grand Prix while talking to my F1 friends in our group chat. And that's what I did. But what I didn't expect was that what we were talking about was barely going to even touch on what was happening in the race.
Say it ain't so, you're built like a gnome. Your wife's a spice girl, why you need a side hoe?
The race started off as expected. Max drives off into the sunset, while Hülkenberg bonked Lance Stroll in turn 1. But then someone dropped a link in the group chat to a Google Drive with the full leak of Christian Horner's text pictures that he allegedly sent to one of his employees. And whoo boy, that derailed the chat more than Hulk derailed Stroll's race. While Crofty and Brundle were providing analysis on the race, my entire friend group was analyzing the now infamous Picture 76, trying to decide if the blurry dark pink appendage was a finger or Horner's hog. And while we didn't reach a consensus, we all agreed that if it is his dong, it must be extremely embarrassing for it to be indistinguishable from a finger. To be clear, I can't confirm if these leaks are real, but the biggest evidence I've seen against their veracity is that nobody who's that bad at flirting could have pulled a Spice Girl. Back to the race, and George is looking really good, extracting some impressive pace from his Mercedes. But unfortunately for Russell, his race ended up going limp as his car ended up getting stuck at only 1% battery. While Lewis's car was clearly made with the same loving care and attention that a foster parent gives to their foster child that they're only caring for to fulfill a contract. And speaking of limp, back in the chat, we were still playing Dick or Finger with Picture 76. Go to the comments right now and say what you think it is. I'm not going to put the picture on screen because YouTube policies, but you should probably go pull the picture up on your phone so you can follow along with my analysis. If you look at the right end of the appendage, I'm certain that is the outline of a fingernail, and I'm pretty sure human penises don't have nails. I could be wrong, because the only one I've ever seen at full mast in real life is my own, but I'm thinking it's more likely he's showing an injured finger here. After putting forth my fingernail thesis, my attention was drawn back to the race, where Logan Sargent had a steering wheel failure which injured his race beyond recovery. Kind of like Christian Horner's reputation after these leaks. And my dicks don't have thumbnails theory was not gaining traction. The women in the group, who assured me they had seen more penises in real life than I had, we're pretty sure that that outline was a sign that he had been circumcised. So if I was going to debunk this theory, I was going to need access to Horndog's medical records to see if we could corroborate the story with evidence of his being cut or uncut. On the subject of being cut, it was hilarious to watch Carlos Sainz, the man being cut from Ferrari, handily beat his teammate in equal machinery. Charles, why am I so unlucky Leclerc, kept having lockups because for whatever reason, one of his front tires kept getting 100 degrees hotter than the other. Which is ironic because Christian Horner's married to quite possibly the hottest Spice Girl, and I haven't seen the woman he was attempting to hook up with, but there is no way that she is 100 degrees hotter than Ginger Spice. That's right, we're back to the dick finger. I'll be honest, I didn't expect to spend a good portion of this race staring at a pink slab of unknown meat. But I'm also pretty sure I can see at least one knuckle there in the center. And if there's one thing I know about dicks, it's that they don't have knuckles. But this is shrugged off by the group who tell me that many a man meat is thicker in that area, and that's probably what that is. But this reporter is not convinced. Just like I'm not convinced that anything has changed since last year. Max is still dominating, Perez is still coasting to second place, Ferrari has the second fastest car but can't get their shit together, and Mercedes still has a car that's a shitbox by their standards, even though any of the backmarker teams would kill for a car that fast. Honestly, the only things that seem to have changed is that Alpine is now as shit as we all knew they could be, and I now have a mental image of Christian Horner that I wish I could remove from my head. I get why that woman filed a complaint. After seeing and reading all of those messages, I also feel like I deserve justice.
Now over to the Canadian positivity guy for the Canadian summary of the Grand Prix. I'm pretty sure it was his dick.
I'm here to educate you about the single biggest Chad on our planet. You see, there is something out there that threatens old drivers' very existence and threatens the Formula One race as we know it. It is a creature that wanders the earth alone. It is half bear, half man, and half Ollie. Some people say that Bear Man isn't experienced enough to be in Formula One. Well, I'm here to tell you that Bear Man is very much old enough, and most certainly talented enough. Bear Man doesn't care who you are or what you've done. Bear Man simply exists to get you. I'm super serial. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, and someday everyone will say, "Thank you, Stacey Hewen, you are awesome," and subscribe to my channel. Okay, that's enough of the Al Gore voice. Oliver Ollie Bearman made his Formula One debut in Jeddah and won Driver of the Day. He was originally set to start on pole in the F2 race, but found himself in the Ferrari seat thanks to some backroom dealings with Carlos Sainz's appendix. This isn't the first time a driver's organs failing has allowed someone to make their Formula One debut. I think back to 2022 when Alex Albon's appendix burst and Nick de Vries got to score the only points he would ever score in Formula One. Woof. But unlike Nick de Vries, who already had saggy balls by the time of his first F1 race, Bearman still had the umbilical cord attached as he made his debut at just 18 years old. The icing on the cake, Bearman got to make his debut in a Ferrari, since he's the backup driver for Haas and Ferrari. Yes, it was luck of the draw that Ferrari happened to need him first, and sure, first time out in a Haas would be a lot less pressure. But debuting in the Ferrari gave him the opportunity to shine. And he did. Missing out on Q3 by a sea hair, he started out in 11th and finished in 7th, earning himself 6 points and 10th place in the Drivers' Championship. Given the performance of the backmarkers this year, there is a very good chance that he finishes around 15th in the championship, beating out drivers that will have been in 23 more races than him.
Fucking embarrassing! Fucking embarrassing!
Fucking embarrassing.
Fucking embarrassing! Fucking embarrassing!
Oh, well that's embarrassing.
Speaking of embarrassing, it's time for the Canadian summary of the Grand Prix. Lance Stroll is a goddamn embarrassment. He was the only person who did not finish the race due to stupidity. He was cutting a corner too close and didn't check himself, so he wrecked himself. Just like he's wrecking Canada's reputation. My God, I think I would have rather Latifi been our legacy than Lance Stroll. Yes, Lance is an objectively better driver, but he is now 7 years in and is still driving like he's playing Gran Turismo with the damage turned off. Meanwhile, a train of British drivers took 4th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th in this race. It reminded me of that time me and 5 British dudes ran a train on your mom. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Bearman really showed off his skills towards the end of the race as he held off both Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton, who were on new softs. Meanwhile, Pierre Gasly, who had to retire his car immediately after the race start, looked like a contestant on a survival show who hasn't eaten in 2 days watching the cameraman eat a cheeseburger. I would say Pierre Gasly is about as impressed with Alpine right now as Christian Horner was with all the reporters at the press conference who wouldn't stop asking him questions about Horner's whole hog barbecue. And that brings us to our poll of the week, where I asked, do you believe the leaked Christian Horner messages and pictures are real? 47% of respondents said yes, they look real, while the remaining 53% said no, they look fake or AI generated. And I think now that AI image and video generation is getting so good, this is going to become an increasingly common defense. People will just claim things are AI generated whenever evidence is leaked, and it will be really difficult to verify it. It's the new, "it wasn't me" defense. In other news, Christian Horner announced he's featuring in a new song with Shaggy called "It Was AI." I sent a text that would linger. It was AI. Blurry pics of my finger. It was AI. Oh, you stuck around to the end of the video? Well then, I guess I owe you the spicy joke of the week. Fans of husky men around the world were excited when they heard a bear man would be entering Formula One. They were all sorely disappointed when they saw that Bearman was actually an 18-year-old European twink.
Picture this while I'm ending this episode, leaving you wanting more. If you liked it, then you should watch this vid about Christian's horn. How could I forget that I had talked about that whole leak? All the time they raced in Bahrain, I was staring at his PP.
In the past 25 races, only 2 drivers have won a race that were not Max Verstappen. Those drivers are Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz. And in that time, they have each won 2 races. But the statistic gets a lot worse if you only look at the last 20 races. In that time, only Carlos Sainz has been able to best Verstappen, and he's managed to do it each time Max was on the cusp of getting 10 victories in a row. After Carlos's victory in Singapore, where he surprised everyone by using the power of friendship, I dubbed him Sainz the Giant Slayer. And now that he's won in Australia while recovering from surgery, I think he's earned that title. Considering these facts, it was a real shock when Ferrari announced that they would be signing Hamilton in 2025, and it would be Carlos Sainz getting the boot. We can argue all day as to whether Leclerc or Sainz is the better driver, and there are good arguments to be made on both sides, but I don't think it's as cut and dry as Leclerc is the better driver when you look at how they've measured up to one another. Sure, Leclerc beat Vettel during Ferrari's years on the struggle bus, but then Sainz finished ahead when he joined the team in 2021. 2022 showed that while Ferrari had the machinery to challenge for the title, neither Charles nor the team were ready for a championship run. There were just too many mistakes from Charles and the team. But even worse was that Sainz took so long to adjust to the car that by the time he got comfortable in it, Red Bull was already running away with the championships. Nobody at Ferrari looked good in 2022. But in 2023, it gets a lot closer. Charles finished 5th in the championship, 2 spots ahead of his teammate, but then Sainz was the only non-Red Bull driver to win a race. If I were to oversimplify the main difference between the 2 drivers, it would be that Charles takes more risks, and when they pay off, he is exceptional. But when the risks don't pay off, it costs him and the team dearly. It's the old bird in the hand versus 2 in the bush conundrum. All that being said, I know Leclerc is Ferrari's golden boy, but it's getting harder and harder to understand why they don't appreciate Sainz. And trust me, they don't appreciate him. There's irrefutable evidence. If you want to see how someone truly feels, look at their actions, not their words. Vasseur was singing Sainz's praises in the press conferences, but nothing speaks louder than when the entire team snubbed Carlos by not showing up to his podium in Bahrain. There was a heartbreaking moment captured on camera by the Spanish media where you can hear Sainz tell his father that only 2 mechanics showed up to celebrate his podium with him. What has he done to deserve this kind of childish treatment? It feels like Ferrari has decided if they're not celebrating a podium with Charles, they're not going to celebrate it at all. It feels like how Red Bull would act if they had Jos Verstappen as team principal and Checo got on the podium when Max didn't. Speaking of Red Bull, that's really who we have to thank for Sainz's success today. Given how Max dominated in both Bahrain and Jeddah, there was no reason to think Australia would be any different. But we were all able to mark ourselves safe from the Dutch national anthem thanks to Red Bull's Employee of the Month, an inanimate carbon brake disc. And Carlos Sainz was there to pick up the pieces. And given that the brake disc actually exploded, there were a lot of pieces to be picked up. Even more concerning though is that it wasn't Checo on top of the podium after Max had his first mechanical failure in over 40 races, which is impressive in and of itself. But right now, I want to talk about Checo. Given how lustily both Mercedes drivers described the speed of the RB20 when they were behind it on track, the fact that Checo finished in just 5th place is unacceptable. If your car is so fast that 2 drivers independently feel the need to comment over team radio as to how fast it is, making up a single place in the Grand Prix is just not good enough. And it's not like Checo started from the back. He lined up 6th place on the starting grid. Max would have almost certainly won the race starting from 6th. And if he ended on the podium, he would have been upset with himself for his lack of performance. And that makes Sainz's win that much more impressive. The odds were definitely not in his favor. He was still recovering from his appendectomy and was clearly still in some discomfort given how stiff he looked while walking around the paddock. There was nothing wrong with Leclerc or his car. And after Verstappen's mechanical failure, there was still another Red Bull rocket ship running around in the top 5. Either one of those drivers should have posed a major threat to Sainz's success. But they didn't,
and I attribute that to pure gumption. Carlos doesn't have a drive lined up for next season despite being at the top of his game, and clearly that's a very motivating factor for a racing driver. I mean, it worked for Checo in 2020 where he ended up landing a drive at Red Bull as a result. Maybe Carlos could take a page from Checo's book and land a seat at his old team. I could see him replacing Perez, or maybe even Max if the rumors are to be believed and Jos ends up taking his ball and going to Mercedes. But my god, after that performance today, why would Max ever want to go to Mercedes? Sure, today Max DNF'd because of a sticky brake disc, but that was his first mechanical failure in over 40 races. I've had a sneaking suspicion that Max has been running his engine slightly detuned for reliability reasons, and that Honda power unit hasn't given him any trouble since the first couple races of 2022, so I'm thinking I might be right. Even today, Max's mechanical failure had nothing to do with the Honda power unit. Meanwhile at Mercedes, it was Lewis's engine that contributed to his half of the double DNF. George, on the other hand, took himself out. Or Alonso did, depending on how you view the incident. But according to the stewards, it was Fernando's fault, so let's go with that. The one thing everyone at Mercedes can agree on, though, is that the RB20 is really fast.
That car's fast. Car's like a rocket ship.
Mercedes might not make a lot of sense for Max, but they do make a lot of sense for Sainz. Not only do they have an open seat, but they cultivate a supportive team environment that I think would be very beneficial for Carlos. Unlike the cutthroat world of Red Bull and the callous atmosphere of Ferrari, Mercedes could provide him with the security, support, and appreciation he deserves. If they're even interested in him as a driver, that is. There are a lot of good open seats, but also a ton of great drivers still available. So there's no guarantee he's even in the conversation for that Mercedes seat while there's still a world champion available to be signed. I'm not even going to pretend like this incident would hinder Fernando's negotiations with Mercedes in any way. I'm sure Toto isn't impressed, but if he got upset with everyone that Jorpedo had a tussle with, there wouldn't be anyone left on the grid in his good books. Heck, George even slapped Bottas on the helmet after they crashed when he was still at Williams, and Toto still gave Ben Russell a drive at Mercedes the next year. It seems like the only Mercedes-powered driver that had a good race in Australia was the Canadian Lance Stroll. And here to talk about it, we have the Canadian Positivity Guy with the Canadian summary of the Grand Prix. Aston Martin may not have a car that can challenge at the front this season, but they are clearly the kings of the midfield, finishing 30 seconds behind Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren, but still ahead of everyone else. If Nando hadn't been given a 20-second penalty, they would have taken a cool 6th and 7th in Australia. But they didn't, and Lance Stroll was there to score the points for the team and redeem himself after taking himself out in Jeddah. And that's my main problem. I don't want Lance to keep redeeming himself with these odd moments of success. I'm tired of him being my country's representation on the grid, and an unexpected good performance like this is the sort of thing that helps Papa Stroll justify keeping him around. He's had 7 years to up his game and prove he's worthy of the seat, but the only thing he's done consistently is disappoint. Flashes of competence are enough to delay getting fired, but not enough to impress. And at this point, I don't think he's capable of impressing. I would rather have no Canadian on the grid than one who bought their way in and wasn't able to convert that into passable competence within 7 years. Lance technically finished ahead of his teammate, but that was only because Fernando got a 20-second penalty. So it's not like he actually outperformed him. It feels a lot like someone who is consistently late for work, waking up early, and leaving early so they can arrive early, only to show up exactly on time because the extra effort they thought they were putting in was actually the bare minimum they should have been doing the whole time. Kind of reminds me of your mom in bed. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. For the poll of the week, I asked, which Ferrari driver will finish ahead in the standings this season? Carlos Sainz or Charles Leclerc? And despite Leclerc currently being ahead in the Drivers' Championship, the majority of respondents still chose Carlos Sainz. In fairness, Sainz missed a race due to appendicitis, but given his consistent performance in the last 12 months, or maybe it's just recency bias, but most people seem to think that Sainz is the safer bet. This is how I know no one at Ferrari follows this channel, because it's obvious that Leclerc is their boy, and nothing anyone can do will change that. I'm not even sure the team wanted to change their drivers, but the owner of Ferrari went and signed Lewis Hamilton, so they had to choose one of their 2 top-tier drivers to give the boot. And they certainly weren't going to chuck Charles. What I'm loving most right now is watching Lewis Hamilton with his
world champions mindset, as he goes into each race with a doom and gloom attitude, spends all his time on track complaining, and then goes to the press conference to cry about his performance. If I was working at Ferrari, watching Sainz limp around the paddock with so much big dick energy that he can't even walk normally, and then seeing the driver we just signed moping around like he's already been defeated, I wouldn't be very excited for the lineup change next year. Sainz seems like exactly who Ferrari needs, in both spirit and real-world performance. And in typical Ferrari fashion, they've gone and fucked this up too. And now, the spicy joke of the week. Following a crash in free practice, Alex Albon took Logan Sargent's car for the Grand Prix as Williams didn't have a spare chassis available. Albon then proceeded to finish outside the points, a major letdown for the team. When Logan Sargent returns to work on Monday and has to try to lift the team's spirits, it's going to feel a lot like having to comfort your wife after her boyfriend broke up with her. Okay, and now that all the sensitive people are gone, here's the real spicy joke of the week. Daniel Ricciardo rocked up to his home race ready to impress, but then got knocked out in Q1 and finished 5 positions behind his teammate. The whole situation felt like inviting your estranged uncle to Christmas after he promises that he'll be better than last time. But then he shows up half drunk, spends the whole night talking about conspiracy theories, and then reminds you why you don't leave him alone around your kids right before you kick him out. I made this next video after YouTube demonetized my channel for repetitive content, and I didn't release it because there wasn't another dominant Verstappen victory, so it didn't really fit the narrative anymore. And also, I had a really prominent F1 YouTuber reach out to me after this all happened, and he offered to edit the video for me, but he never ended up getting around to it. So if you need lots of B-roll and fun, exciting things on screen, be prepared. It's just a talking head. You can look to the chapters below if you want to skip past it. Formula One has become so repetitive that YouTube actually demonetized my channel for repetitive content. When I tried to ask why, they gave me the old, "If you don't know what you did wrong, I'm not going to tell you" response, which surprised me because I didn't realize that my mother was in charge of making corporate policies at Google. Honestly, on some level I get it. There are only so many jokes I can make about Verstappen's dominance, Ferrari's incompetence, and Mercedes' fall from grace. Trying to make a new and interesting video about each race gets tougher and tougher when the results continue to be the same for years on end. But this is nothing new for Formula One. Or is it? While Mercedes dominated the turbo hybrid era, there were still other race winners. Not to mention that sometimes other drivers would even lead the championship. I think back to when Seb was at Ferrari, and at least in the first parts of 2017 and 2018, it did seem like they were able to take the fight to Mercedes, even if they weren't able to sustain it throughout the entire season. We got that again with Ferrari and Leclerc in 2022, briefly, but that was the last time anyone was able to hold a candle to the Max Newey Megazord that is breaking all the records. But that was the last time anyone held a candle to the Max Newey combo that is shattering all the records. To make matters worse, 2024 is historic in that all of the drivers who were on the grid for the final race of the prior season are still in the same seat for the first race of this season. And if De Vries hadn't lost his seat 10 races into 2023, we would have gone 2 full years without so much as a silly season to keep us occupied. This has complicated matters, not just for the fans, but for the people who create content surrounding the sport. This level of stagnation is actually setting off algorithmic triggers that exist on YouTube to demonetize content farms and low-effort content. I used to make short videos every season in the form of starting grid animations, but it would be their wives and girlfriends, or the literal translations of their names, or I'd make them all American, etc. But given how stagnant the sport has been, this content is getting flagged as repetitive because so little is changing from one season to the next. At least for 2025, we know there will be huge shakeups to the grid, thanks to Hamilton's shock move to Ferrari, as well as how many drivers have their contracts expiring at the end of this year. And for 2026, there's going to be a rules change, and we have the new entrance of Audi, who's doubled down on their F1 investment by buying the entire Sauber team. But none of that addresses the fact that 2024 is going to be a historically boring season, and that affects the whole F1 ecosystem. Tomo mentioned in a video last year that the views on his channel are down consistently, and I believe that has nothing to do with the quality of his content, which is fantastic, by the way. Love you, Tomo. Those of us who are truly invested in the sport know how to look at a race and find the stories in it that aren't just the battle for first place. But the general public and the casual fans, who are incredibly important to the health of a sport, want to see a fight for the glory of victory. And if that's a foregone conclusion, they're not interested. And I'll admit, I've started to feel the same way recently. In order to keep yourself interested in a sport as a spectator, you need to find ways to invest yourself emotionally in the outcome. For many people, that's choosing a favorite athlete or team so you can be excited when they win and disappointed when they lose. The risk of loss needs to be there to create stakes so the win is meaningful. Not only did it create an emotional high, but it also avoided an emotional low. And that's basically not possible in F1 right now. Max Verstappen is so used to winning, he isn't even excited by victories anymore. He just expects them. He's like a smoker who no longer gets the rush from nicotine, but rather he needs to win just to feel normal. And I'm sure a lot of his fans feel the same. Where's the excitement in just watching him drive off into the distance every other Sunday? There's no challenge, no obstacles for him to overcome. It would be nice if he could be challenged for a victory once in a while, even if that's from his own teammate. But that isn't happening right now. I suppose we get some enjoyment in guessing who's going to be in that Red Bull seat next year, and given all the drama at Milton Keynes, we at least have that to talk about. But with all of the excitement this season happening off track, there is less and less incentive to actually watch the races. You don't need to watch Max dunk in Bahrain to follow Andretti's attempts to get on the grid while Alpine and Red Bull tear themselves apart. Saudi Arabia brought with it one unique plot thread, Ollie Behrman's debut, but the chances of him getting another drive in the next year are slim, so realistically that's only going to be interesting for a couple weeks. You can tell that this was the only interesting development in the sport at the time by looking at how his name dominated the headlines in all of the F1 content that came out in the week following Jeddah. But that quickly dried up. So what do other sports do to increase engagement during periods of dominance? Rules changes often work, like they did in 2021 to bring Red Bull close enough to challenge Mercedes. But in the current cost cap era, it seems that Formula One is hesitant to go this route, and I understand why. F1 isn't like other sports because it is, at its core, competitive engineering. The amount of money you can spend directly impacts what you can do. Mercedes, for example, has been open about the fact that if they were allowed to spend freely, they would be developing a whole second car concept simultaneously. They would have rebuilt the car from the ground up long before they did. And they may not have ridden out the zero pod concept for as long as they did. A rules change to nerf Red Bull also may not have the desired effect because they have Adrian Newey, the most talented aerodynamicist of multiple generations. So regardless of what rules changes come in, he's likely to exploit them to their fullest, and Ferrari and Mercedes won't be able to just throw money at beating whatever he designs. But there has been another development in the world of sports, one that has increased viewership and retention on sporting events, even if they're a complete blowout. But embracing it is a deal with the devil I'm not sure I want to see Formula One make. I'm talking, of course, about sports gambling. Professional sports in America, the NFL in particular, have seen a surge in viewership and retention thanks to gambling. They're not even running the sites themselves, but rather they find themselves in a symbiotic relationship where they want to encourage people to gamble on their events, so that way they tune in and stick around right to the end to see what the point spread was, to find out if their bet paid off. It pays off twofold. They take huge money in sponsorship and advertising from sites like DraftKings. Then people gamble on their events, then they see increased viewership and retention, and in turn can charge even more money for sponsorship and advertising. As a Canadian, I am inundated with American content. And America these days is all in on gambling. It's a stark contrast from when I was growing up and legal gambling seemed to be contained to casinos. You couldn't even bet on individual sports events during my formative years, but nowadays it's as simple as going to a website. Not sure which one to use? No worries. Watch just one live American sporting event and you'll see ads for at least a few. And it's not like I'm knocking it without trying it. Full disclosure, in 2021 and 2022, I tried gambling on Formula One, and it did make a difference. I put about $100 into an account, and I made small bets each race on which drivers I thought would beat their teammates. At one point, the account had as much as $500 of winnings in it, but that all slowly went away over the course of a season, and eventually the account was empty. And that's when I decided gambling wasn't for me, because I didn't want to put any more money into it. If you have the money to blow, it is a simple and easy way to give yourself a vested interest in the outcome of an event, even if you're not betting on the winner. I know a few people who are extremely into sports,
And as far as I can tell, a lot of their interest comes from the fact that they've placed bets on the game. This is how they demonstrate their knowledge of the sport and benefit from said knowledge. It's a form of skill expression, and I can understand why it's so addictive. And that's the problem right there. Gambling's addictive. It seems like society over the past 15 years has decided that gambling is not a vice to be regulated, but rather a human weakness to be exploited for profit. And that brings us back to the main point. Engaging with Formula One races this season is going to take active and deliberate effort. You can't expect competition or excitement at the front, so you need to find other avenues to stay invested. Until this week, the method I've chosen to invest emotionally in Formula One is through this YouTube channel, making videos to entertain and hopefully drive discussion with other F1 fans. I give up a lot every season to make these videos. The race is usually from 8 to 10 a.m. local time, then I spend a few hours working on a script, then I record the video, then I edit it, which usually takes me until about midnight. I do all this to hopefully have it out before the Brits wake up Monday morning. But YouTube itself has decided that F1 is too repetitive to be worth paying me for my efforts. As of the making of this video, we are just 3 races into a 24 race season, and I am unwilling to maintain such a rigorous schedule for 21 more races if the platform that my videos are published on is unwilling to give me a share of the revenue that they make from running ads on my content. And believe me, they'll be running ads on my videos whether the channel is monetized or not. But maybe this is a good thing. Trying to find a compelling story in each race has been getting harder and harder, and it has been ever since the middle of 2022 when Red Bull started pulling away from the rest of the pack. I've decided I'm going to take the route that we all wish Formula One would take and go for quality over quantity. I'm only going to make a video when there's a story worth telling. And on weekends, where it was just a 90-minute parade behind Verstappen, I'm just going to watch the race, enjoy it, and not worry about publishing a video just because a race happened. Everyone outside of Liberty Media agrees that 24 races is too much, especially when so many of them are just street circuits that are only on the calendar because their government is willing to pay whatever it takes to get a little bit of that sports washing action. Maybe now I'll have time to catch the odd Indy or NASCAR race. 2 motorsports that I've been interested in but neglected because my waking hours on Sundays have been dedicated to getting a Formula One video produced and published. If there's an interesting F1 race, I'll be happy to spend the whole day putting together a video. But if there isn't, I'm just going to relax and enjoy the show, as well as my day of rest. But don't worry, I'm not stepping away from this channel, and I'm certainly not stepping away from content creation. For the next 90 days, while I wait to reapply for monetization, the only compensation I will be receiving is from my Patreon. So if you want to show your support, signing up for just $5 a month would mean the world to me. And if you're seeing this, it means that in the time since this video was recorded, Fiends has been reinstated into the YouTube Partner Program. I chose to record this alternate ending because I think it's important to communicate and give people a sense of closure, unlike some billion-dollar companies. I'll leave a pinned comment explaining the resolution so you can get more detail if you want it. The story of the Japanese Grand Prix is the story of 2024. This race felt so generic that I thought someone had just filled out a template for 2024 Formula One race. Then I got an idea. If I set up this video as a template where I only have to change minor details after each race, I could save myself a ton of work this season. Keep watching and you'll see what I mean. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, even when the season is over before it starts. It was a great race for Red Bull, as Max Verstappen took pole in Suzuka, which he then converted into a victory of over 20 seconds, ahead of everyone who wasn't in a Red Bull. Max's teammate, Sergio Perez, finished 10 seconds behind Verstappen, after qualifying on the front row. Red Bull's team principal, Christian Horner, said he and the team were pleased with the results. Over at Red Bull's second team, Visa Crash App Arby's, Daniel Ricciardo was disappointed with his results after crashing out at turn 2. He finished behind his teammate Yuki Tsunoda for the 3rd race in a row. Despite Yuki's consistent performance, he is still not being considered to replace Checo. Meanwhile at Ferrari, Carlos Sainz outperformed his teammate once again. It was very clear they had the second fastest car, but they were still nowhere near fast enough to beat Adrian Newey's RB20 rocket ship. Ferrari, surprisingly, got the strategy right and finished 3rd and 4th. The Tifosi were encouraged by these results and insisted that next year will be Ferrari's year.
McLaren had a decent race, finishing behind Red Bull and Ferrari. They spent most of the race scrapping with Mercedes, but ultimately came out on top. The drivers expressed that they were happy with the progress the team has made this year, but they're still going to need to keep pushing and improving the car if they're ever going to win a race. In contrast, the Mercedes drivers were split in terms of how they felt. Lewis Hamilton spent the race complaining on the radio and seemed defeated well before the race was over, while George Russell had a much better race despite his collision with Oscar Piastri. Aston Martin's drivers also had two very different races. Fernando Alonso finished at the front of the midfield, while Lance Stroll was so far behind that it felt like he was racing in a different category. And he agreed.
It's unbelievable how bad our speed is on the straight. Like, it's a different category.
Despite his performance, there is still no question that Lance Stroll will keep his seat because his dad owns the team. Looking further down the grid, Sauber still seems unable to figure out how to do a Formula 1 pit stop, with Bottas's race being ruined by a stop that took over 8 seconds. And Haas, while still trash, was at least looking good in comparison to Alpine, who were so slow that fans have been calling for them to give up and sell the team. And Williams was once again put in a tough place thanks to Alex Albon crashing his car, which was made even tougher as they were still recovering from Alex Albon's crash at the last race. I would like to say that team principal James Vowles didn't mince words when he addressed the issue in the debrief video that he published on YouTube after the race, but once again, he spoke so quietly that it was hard to understand what he was saying. It was also hard to understand what was the point of watching this race? Well, most people would describe the 2024 Japanese Grand Prix as a boring parade behind Verstappen. Die-hard F1 fans are pointing out that if you ignore Max and Red Bull, there was a lot of exciting racing given how tight the pack is. But for a lot of people, if there's no competition for the victory, there's no point in watching. You can tell the pundits know this because in the lead up to the race, they kept hyping up Sergio Perez as a potential challenger to Max, as he was only 600ths off pole position, but I think we all knew, come race day, that wasn't gonna matter. Speaking of not mattering, here's a Canadian opinion on this Grand Prix.
Well, you've heard the British guys enough, so why don't you listen to somebody else for a change?
Lance Stroll sucks and I hate him. Unlike your mom, who I love, because she sucks. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. For the poll of the week, I asked, how do you feel about F1 drivers posting thirst traps on Instagram? 18% of respondents said they like it and that's why they follow them, 9% said they don't like it, and the vast majority of respondents said they don't care. The reason I ask is because I was thinking of getting back to parodying the drivers' thirst traps on the Fiend's official Instagram account. Let me know in the comments if you think I should start doing that again. For all the people who stuck it out to the end of the video, here's your spicy joke of the week. The race in Suzuka was both very late at night for us Canadians and very boring. Starting at midnight and finishing after 2:30 a.m., I had to drink a ton of coffee just to stay awake to the end. But I'm glad I did, because the explosive diarrhea that followed was the most exciting thing I experienced during this race. The next time someone asks you to name something high quality that's made in China, look them straight in the eyes and say, racing. From the start of sprint quali all the way through to the final lap of the Grand Prix, there is one word that describes the racing in Shanghai. Fun. And boy, did we ever need that. There was something for everyone this weekend, with one exception. The people who can only achieve climax when Verstappen doesn't win got left out. But for everyone else, there was certainly something to enjoy. This weekend may have changed my opinion slightly on sprint races. I've been saying for years now that unless they're reverse grid, I struggle to see what sprints bring to a race weekend. But Shanghai showed me just how much value a sprint can add even without a major format change. It's like adding a half scoop of ice cream on top of your scoop of ice cream. Sure, it's more of the same, but I love ice cream. Why am I complaining about getting more just because it isn't a different flavor? Right from the start of sprint qualifying, we were in for a real treat. Changing weather conditions meant quali was completely unpredictable. Hometown hero Zhou Guanyu managed to scrape his way into Q2 and Q3, which the crowd loved, and by the end of Q3, provisional pole had changed hands so many times in the last 5 minutes that I lost count. All of this chaos ended up with Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton on the front row, with Fernando Alonso right behind them. Then there was the sprint itself. Norris choked immediately, as is tradition, and then it was Lewis's race to lose, which he both did and didn't. It was delicious watching Rosberg making comments about how easy it would have been to defend.
Could have easily got more aggressive there in that hairpin and just closed the door properly. There was no reason why not. Close the door, Lewis. Like, go aggressive, just properly close it.
Yeah.
Pity just let him through so easily.
But let's be real, Lewis only lost the sprint if you subscribe to the Bobby family credo.
If you ain't first, you're last.
Second place in a race where Max reached the finish line is basically a win in 2024. Oof. As for us Alonso fans, we had to have a support group meeting after the end of that sprint. And we're not supposed to tell outside people about what we say in group. By this point, we're only at Saturday and I've already burnt out my adrenal glands. But then we had quali for the actual Grand Prix and it went pretty well as expected. Except for Lewis going out in Q1. What was that all about? I mean, I would have thought getting second place in the sprint would have brought his mojo back. But now it's looking more like we're going to have to send a secret agent back in time if we want to retrieve his mojo.
I have his mojo.
Race day, I have but one quibble with. 2 a.m. start time, for me, just isn't feasible. And that's it. That's my only complaint about this entire weekend. And that should speak volumes for a season I have been vocally frustrated with. I don't even care that Max did so much dunking that we should start calling him donuts. Everyone else was putting on a world-class display of close racing, while Max was doing a masterclass in extracting race pace from a car. In the early stages of the race, Verstappen was a second and a half per lap faster than everyone else. I'm not even mad, I'm just impressed. I love this circuit. And that, right there, is what could fix F1. People are far more accepting of a dominant season if the racing is good. And the racing is always better at purpose-built circuits. And they don't all have to be old school tracks. Circuit of the Americas and Shanghai are both great examples of younger circuits that are still phenomenal. They have soul. They have passing opportunities. They have unique features like the big sweeping section in Coda, or the snails at turns 1 to 4 and 11 to 13 in China. And that's why, if they're going to keep this huge calendar, they need to prioritize the quality of the tracks that they're racing at. I know the number of races each year, as well as the number of street circuits, are common criticisms, but they can't have both. I can accept a 24 race calendar if it's mostly at great tracks and the street circuits are kept to a minimum. But if we're gonna have 10 street races a year, I fail to see the point. A street race now and then is nice to shake things up. It's like the icing on the cake. It's great, but nobody wants to eat a bowl full of icing. It's clear that purpose-built tracks are more fun to drive, and when the drivers are having fun, it's always more fun to watch. You'll never see a battle at a street circuit where they go back and forth every corner like we did with Stroll and Magnussen in this race. And on that subject, there's a Canadian who wants to talk about exactly that. I'm going to do a turn-by-turn review of that incredible battle between Stroll and Magnussen, and for those of you who are hard of hearing, I'll be interpreting in the corner. Oh, yeah. I've got the better driver in the worst car and the worst driver in a better car. Oh, it's so close. There's no clear victory yet. Oh my God. Oh, you just don't get this at a street circuit. Oh, but it's not over yet. He's got DRS and they're back into it. Oh! My God. That lap left my balls emptier than your mom does. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Lando Norris fans were definitely stoked that he didn't choke in the Grand Prix, but he still doesn't have that coveted W. One weird thing I've noticed is how the commentators keep saying that he's always the bridesmaid, never the bride. And I mean, it kind of makes sense, but only if you don't think about it all that much. As far as being a bridesmaid goes, it's not like he's being invited onto the podium by Max. And I fail to see how a win is like getting married. I mean, it's not like winning an F1 race makes you let yourself go and slowly saps your will to live. That one's for all the boomers. I got you. I think most people were surprised to see a McLaren up there in second place, but even more surprising than that was how Piastri struggled. Oscar's my boy. I mean, he shares a first name with my baloney.
It's O-S-C-A-R.
But he needs to figure out tire management. Lando's expert tire management allowed him to keep his rubber alive long enough to cruise to the podium. But Oscar's tires fell off quickly and cost him significant pace compared to his teammate. If Piastri truly is the next big thing, as the pundits would have you believe, he needs to figure this out fast. If there's one thing Grosjean proved, it's that if you want to do hot laps every lap, F1 is the wrong category for you. Then of course, there's Fernando Alonso. For a guy who was fighting at the front pretty much the whole time, a DNF in the sprint and 7th in the Grand Prix just feels rough. You don't need to be Nico Rosberg to see that Aston screwed him with Ferrari tier strategy when they put him on softs behind the safety car. But luckily for us, Nico was happy to point that out. And that's why we love him. That's why this week, for the poll of the week, I didn't even ask a question. Because there is no question. Nico Rosberg needs to come out of retirement to beat Verstappen in equal machinery. He's the GOAT Slayer. And we need him to put Max down the same way he did Lewis and Michael. Speaking of getting put down, Crofty said,
RB stands for really bad.
But I think we all know RB stands for Ricciardo's beaten. And if you didn't think that was spicy enough, here's the spicy joke of the week. Stroll rear-ended Ricciardo during the safety car restart, taking him out of the race. Given how desperately Daniel needed to finish ahead of Yuki, getting hit from behind really fucked him in the ass.
In the heart of the Melbourne storm, someone asked me so calm and cool. I heard his lap times, they just ain't the same. No more victories, do you feel like a fool? But in the stands they still chant his name, and I smiled, took a sip of my cold brew. And I told them, you will never be right, 'cause he never left until the day that I die. I believe he was the best, and he'd be a world champion if it wasn't for losing that engine from Mercedes. Some say he should have stayed at Red Bull, but they forget he killed it at a Renault. McLaren messed with his head, broken down, took what made him special. Now he's back at home, back where he belongs. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was Daniel. He's been killing it, Daniel is what he's been killing. But that RB just ain't a Red Bull. We know what Danny could do with it. Marco saw that flame within him, so did I, that's why I keep cheering. He jumped in and matched the ghost pole out. Checo's car's what he should have been given. When he gets it, we'll all be grinning. Some say he should have stayed at Red Bull, but they forget he killed it at a Renault. McLaren messed with his head, broken down, took what made him special. Now he's back at home, back where he belongs. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was Daniel.
When the Miami Grand Prix first came about, it quickly became known as the American Cringe Fest. From fake boats in the fake marina to the laughable driver introductions, all on a low-quality street circuit. When you added in the insane ticket prices, it quickly became the laughingstock of the F1 calendar. But this year, I'm pleased to say, Cringe Fest is cancelled. The race organizers learned from their mistakes and stopped taking themselves so seriously. They leaned into the silly nature of the fake marina, and now they consider it a point of pride, in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. And they also cancelled the driver introductions, which made my butt pucker so hard, I was picking bits of the couch out of it for the rest of the week. And it gets better. Not only did the organizers tone down the cringe, but the drivers dialed up the racing. As I'm sure you know, Lando Norris finally took his first victory on merit. Let's talk about that. Welcome to Race Weekend Update. This is the story of the 2024 Miami Grand Prix. Max Verstappen made a mistake for the first time in years, opening the door for Lando Norris to take his first victory after more than 100 races. Max didn't seem too upset by this. In fact, it was actually quite cute watching him wave to Lando from his car during the cooldown lap. And Max wasn't the only driver who wanted to celebrate Norris's maiden victory with him. Sainz came and put his arm around his former teammate and bromantic partner, while Fernando Alonso came over to Parc Ferme to give Lando his congratulations. Everyone was happy for Lando Norris today. Everyone except me, that is, because I lost my shirt over this race. Literally.
To me!
That's right. My friend Emily and I had a bet going where if Lando Norris won a race before Oscar Piastri, I would give her both my Lando Norris shirts. To give her some odds here, because mine aren't authentic, she was going to buy me a real Oscar Piastri shirt if he won. And I was pretty convinced he was going to today. But I'm a man of my word, so Emily, you can have my shirt.
And you can have mine.
Right, I guess I'm going to need to wear something to finish this episode.
Luckily, this one is beautiful, stretchy, and floral. Oh, that feels like victory.
And I feel like Oscar Piastri feels now.
Thanks, Stace. I gotta say, I can't wait till the other one makes its way into my closet as well. I'm one happy Lando Norris fan.
And now I know how Piastri feels. He also lost his shirt today. He was on fire for the first half of the race, but he got hit with Leclerc levels of luck when the safety car came immediately after his pit stop, opening the door for Norris to take the lead. And while Lando sailed off into the sunset, things only went downhill for the Australian from there. After getting into a tussle that damaged his front wing, he went from being Max's potential challenger to the guy who finished behind both Alpines, all thanks to one silly mistake. The most shocking mistake, though, was Max taking out a cone, damaging his car just enough to keep him from catching up to the McLaren of Lando Norris. And from then on, it was just pure stress all the way to the end. Here's an actual photo of Emily, the biggest Lando fan I know, watching the final leg of the race. As soon as the race finished, she rushed over here to collect on our bet. So honestly, I'm not that upset if she found the race stressful to watch. You could tell it was also stressful to Max, who got on the radio to let his team know he was having trouble turning the car. Classic champion's attitude. Whining on the radio to make sure everyone knows it's not your fault when you lose. And when you're the default winner, second place is losing.
If you ain't first, you're last.
But Max wasn't the only person who would have felt like they lost this race. Logan Sargent, who was already a shell of a man going into his home race, crashed out early on.
Watch this, Lise. You can actually pinpoint the second when his heart rips in half. And now.
Williams' team boss, James Vowles, was getting a lot of questions this weekend about replacing Sargent, and James remained adamant that he had no plans to replace Logan, while at the same time he was filing for an exemption for Kimi Antonelli to race before he turns 18. And since his birthday is August 25th, the only reason to apply for such an exemption would be because he wants to replace Logan before the summer break. A lot of people seemed shocked by his ruthless behavior, but they seem to be forgetting that this is literally the James from Valtteri It's James. So I'm not surprised that Sargent is getting the Bottas treatment. It wasn't all bad for Logan though. Sure, he may have crashed out and finished last, but since it was his home Grand Prix, it wasn't a very far walk for him to get home. That's right, only winners get rides home. It's a real James Vowles quote. On the subject of shitting the bed, former king of the streets, Checo Perez, only managed to take 5th place in the most dominant Formula One car of all time. This would have been more worrying to him if Daniel had done as well in the Grand Prix as he did in the sprint. Speaking of America's other driver, Daniel Ricciardo got 4th place in the sprint, but finished outside the points in the Grand Prix while his teammate Yuki Tsunoda finished in the points once again. In short, things started out promising, but ended in disappointment. Kind of like his career. At least the Ferraris were looking good out there. Figuratively, taking 3rd and 4th, they must have been quite happy. But as for how they looked literally, well, they looked like a child took the bucket tool and MS Paint and added some blue to their livery. Their livery looked like such shit that I'm going to start calling them Scoo Diarrhea Ferrari. You might be wondering why they added the blue, and that's because they brought on title sponsor Hewlett-Packard. They wanted to make their new partnership known by chewing up the beautiful red Ferrari livery and spitting out a gross mashup of colors. Kind of the way their printers do. When asked why HP wanted to partner with Ferrari, they said, "We recently failed to implement printers as a subscription and are being sued by multiple nations for anti-competitive behavior in the printer ink market. Given our history with failed strategies, we found the team at Ferrari to be kindred spirits." And now over to the Canadian positivity guy for the Canadian summary of the Grand Prix. Lando Norris was saying all weekend, even hooked up to a lie detector at one point, that he believed he would win a race with McLaren. And he did. But he also managed to do it on a weekend where he had a bandage on his nose thanks to an undescribed situation where he got cut by broken glass while partying in Amsterdam. Just his luck that the day where his face would be plastered all over everything and his picture would go down in the history books would be the one time he has a wound on his face. Getting the real hockey experience. Respect. You might say he used up his bad luck on that wound. Kind of like when you've been waiting on hold forever for customer service and you go to take a dump only for them to pick up. It's not ideal, but I'll take it. Which is exactly what your mom says whenever I can't get it all the way up.
It's not ideal, but I'll take it.
For the poll of the week, I asked, do you watch the pre-race show? And most people said they prefer not to watch the pre-race show, which wasn't surprising to me. I usually only catch the tail end of it while I'm waiting for the Grand Prix to start. But this year, I tuned in for the whole thing, purely because I wanted to see if it would be as big of a train wreck as it was last year. And I'm pleased to say it was pretty normal. It didn't feel like they were trying too hard the way it did in 2023. And I'm hoping that going forward, the organizers continue to treat the event more like a Grand Prix and less like a music festival. And now, for everyone who's made it this far, I give you the spicy joke of the week. Williams has applied for an exemption to allow Kimi Antonelli to race at just 17 years old. Given that he turns 18 at the end of August, you might be wondering, why are they rushing? There should be plenty of time. Until you realize what's actually going on. He's F1's first Make-A-Wish driver. The official name for Imola this year was Formula 1 MSC Cruises Gran Premio del Made in Italy e dell'Emilia Romagna 2024. And I've wasted so much time saying it that I now have to rush through the rest of this video. This is Imola 2024 as fast as possible. Let's go. Nothing happened in the race start or in the first corner. Max took pole and victory, as is tradition. Even more impressive, he showed up after doing a 4-hour stint in a sim race, because F1 is now his side hustle. Piastri was fast as hell, but couldn't get past Sainz. Until he did. Lando was catching Max at the end, and looking like he might challenge for the victory. But he didn't. Max had 3 warnings for track limits, and could have lost to Lando if he got a penalty for it. But he didn't. The backmarkers threw their Hail Marys on lap 9 and pitted early. It didn't help at all. Williams is finally competing with Sauber for having the worst pit stops. Sargent finally beat Albon because Alex didn't finish. Alonso botched quali and needed to make up for it in the race. He didn't. Checo also botched quali but didn't shit the bed quite as hard as Fernando. His weekend was more like a shard. Checo said his trip through the gravel compromised his race, which is why he took 8th. But Lewis did the same and beat both his teammate and one Red Bull. Mercedes took 6th and 7th. But nobody seemed to notice. Hulk was looking hot, but only got 11th. Still beat Magnussen. All eyes were on Yuki this weekend, even though he only got 10th. Still beat Danny. Joe finally beat Bottas, even though neither of them got any points this weekend. Or job offers. Ocon beat Gasly again, but Gasly is still the favorite driver at Alpine. Alonso pitted near the end of the race to give his pit crew some extra practice, something Williams and Sauber should consider doing. Lance Stroll got points today, and is still only just ahead of an 18-year-old rookie who's only participated in a single race. Leclerc got a podium today, giving him 2nd place in the Drivers' Championship, or, more accurately, Checo gifted Charles 2nd place in the championship today. Then, as soon as the race was over, Lewis Hamilton had to leave immediately to go participate in Mortal Kombat. Monaco, the crown jewel of Formula 1. A relic from days gone by, kept alive thanks to tradition and passion. A unique street circuit that's generally too small for modern F1 cars to pass on track, making it a competition of pit strategy. But what happens when you entirely remove the need for pit stops in a race like this? Welcome to Race Weekend Update. Let's talk about how that race was terrible, but also gave me hope for this season.
We heard you say that it was a bit boring. I guess.
How was it for you?
Oh! Max doesn't mince words, especially when he's saying what we're all thinking. But it gets better.
Most of the race, we were all driving like 4 seconds of the pace, I think. So the red flag basically ruined it a bit because then everyone had a free pit stop.
There's really no other way to sum up this race. Exciting start, then absolutely ruined by the red flag after turn 1. The worst possible thing that could have happened for the quality of racing was for that flag to hit on lap 1, allowing teams to change their tires and effectively remove the need for pit stops entirely, thanks to them having technically run 2 compounds. Before we get too far into it, I want to make 2 things clear. I'm happy for Leclerc, and I love Monaco. It's one of my favorite historical tracks. I fully recognize that it's not really suitable for modern F1 cars, but it forces teams to jockey for position through pit strategy, and honestly, I enjoy seeing this older style of race, reminiscent of the times right before DRS. Yes, it wasn't the most exciting era, but it requires a different skill set and mindset from the drivers and the teams, and it's a nice way to mix things up. Like playing your old N64 because you're bored of your PS5. It's a fun change of pace, even if it's a downgrade in quality. But this year, Monaco was the Grand Prix equivalent of Superman 64. I can't believe that I'm saying this because it wasn't a race that Verstappen won, but this was the most boring race I have ever watched.
Definitely one of the dullest of races I think I've been in.
Given how the ground effects era has been playing out, I would have assumed that a race where Verstappen won would have taken the prize for most boring race ever. But apparently, this is the one title Max won't be winning. Regardless of how boring the race was, though, nothing can take away from Charles' achievement. He won his home race! In fact, that's the most exciting thing that happened this weekend. If you ignore the Indy 500. Leclerc lucked out, sailing from pole to victory, safely protected from Ferrari's strategic incompetence thanks to the lack of pit stops. This almost puts him within striking distance of Verstappen, and while it doesn't mean we're going to have an actual title fight on our hands, it gives me hope that we're going to get more variety this season than we got last season. 2023 had just 3 winners across 2 teams: Verstappen, Perez, and Sainz. 2024 has already had 4 different drivers across 3 different teams: Verstappen, Sainz, Norris, and Leclerc. Even if Max leads the championship all season, at least other drivers and other cars are still in the mix for wins. This season, I'm hoping it's more like Vettel winning 2010 than when Vettel won 2013. I don't care if Max wins it all, so long as he has to work for it, and other drivers have a legitimate shot at winning each race. And on that subject, we have the Canadian Positivity Guy here to talk about the race. Just because you're in a car that can win doesn't mean that you will win. Case in point, former King of the Streets, Sergio Perez. He got taken out by Haas-hole Kevin Magnussen, but here's the thing. Perez should have never been in the mix with a Haas. So yes, it may not have been entirely his fault that he got taken out of the race, but it is his fault for being that far back in the first place. Max has shown us what that Red Bull is capable of, and for it to get knocked out in Q1 is a travesty. It's the sort of thing that should never happen. Like the door getting sucked off a plane mid-flight. Just kidding, I value my life. I would never criticize Boeing. And speaking of getting sucked off mid-flight, tell your mom I had a great time on the way home from our vacation together. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Oh, hey, it's my dad, the guy who is renting me this space.
Wow, and also a lot of my stuff I collected over the last, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years is all up on the wall here. And you know, I was cleaning up my office the other day and I found something. I thought you'd get a kick out of this.
Oh, very cool.
Let me get this.
That is so cool.
Isn't that neat?
That is awesome.
I was just sitting up on the wall and I didn't even notice it there. And I thought, you know what? It needs a little cleaning. It was coated in dust. I should have done a video of the dirt that was in it.
It's battery operated.
Yeah.
So you could drive this thing around?
I guess so. I put a little, remote. I don't even think it was remote control back in those days. I don't know. Is this the on-off button? Maybe. I don't know. But hey, I thought you'd like it. Look good on the wall somewhere.
I appreciate it. You'll have to come back later and tell us more about the other stuff that's on the wall.
I won't interrupt you next time. All right, see you later.
Thanks, Dad.
During the post-race show, Laura Winter put on a masterclass for how to get yourself invited to a party. Let's take a look.
But can I just ask, Charles said this is going to be a very big night for all of us celebrating here. Can you give us an insight to what's planned for a party tonight for the Leclerc family?
Yeah, it's time to party now. If
you want, you can come. That, don't you?
Oh, you're Alpine, you can.
I put red on, don't worry.
Yeah, you're invited if you want, but yeah, big party.
We'll see, we'll get the invite. Thank you very much. I've heard there's a big party, Fred. Are we invited?
The prince invited me at the party tonight.
It's going to be a big party. I've got the trophy in my back pocket and a party invite for tonight as well.
As it turns out, the trick to getting invited to exclusive parties is to put people on the spot by asking them on live television.
For the poll of the week. This week, I asked you to give the race in Monaco a grade. More than half of respondents gave it a D or an F, for obvious reasons, and 16% thought it was average, giving it a C. And the remaining 19% must be Charles Leclerc fans, because that's the only reason I can think of that you'd give this race a B or an A. Or maybe they just really hate Esteban Ocon and were happy to see him take himself out of the race by being a bad teammate. Seriously, Ocon must be one of the worst teammates in all of history. In my opinion, the top 3 worst teammates of all time are, in this order, number 3, Tanya Harding, number 2, Judas, and number 1, Esteban Ocon. Pierre Gasly is right to be furious. And sure, you can give Ocon credit for taking responsibility for his actions and apologizing, but it doesn't change what he did. It's like when Louis C.K. publicly acknowledged and apologized for jerking off in front of those women. Like, yes, it's great you're admitting you were in the wrong and not fighting it, but you should have never put that person who you supposedly respect in that position in the first place. Instead of using the end of this video to direct you to the next thing of mine you should watch, I'm going to instead tell you about something cool that happened in my life. Comedian Josh Adam Myers pulled me out of the audience and brought me on stage, and together we spent like 10 minutes just going back and forth, making up a song on the spot, and it was so much fun. He's been posting clips of it to his Instagram and TikTok, and I'll link them below. If you think it's fun, maybe check him out and let him know I sent you. Esteban Ocon's really gone and done it this time. That little stint he pulled in Monaco cost him more than just that race. Given the timing of this news release from Alpine, it's clear that it cost him his seat. And frankly, who could blame them? He has not been a good teammate for pretty much the entire time that he's been at Alpine.
Never in my life I saw a defense like Esteban.
But I'm not going to stand here and dunk on Ocon like everybody else is going to do. I just don't feel like there's anything new that I would have to contribute. Anything negative I could say about Esteban Ocon, you have almost certainly heard before. But I don't feel like there's a lot of people who are being really positive about him. And while I'm not going to be standing here singing his praises, he is a Grand Prix winner, and you don't get into F1 by accident. There are plenty of deserving people who don't get on the grid, unless they have daddy's money. But for someone who doesn't come from money, it's clear that he has speed. Again, he's a Grand Prix winner, so there has to be something more there. So instead, I'm going to say everything nice that I can think of about Esteban Ocon. And now, without further ado, here's everything nice that I have to say about Esteban Ocon. Look, if I hadn't stood there silent, you would have known that I wasn't going to say anything nice. I had to put that in. Oh, sometimes when the lighting is just right and his hair is pretty good, he doesn't look like a weird mouse dude.
What exactly does Canada want?
We want
more passing.
More passing from where?
Just more passing, you know? Canada isn't Monaco. Other countries have lots of passing. We want some of that action. How about intermittent weather? Drying tracks make great races. We'll make it rain and stop.
We'll make it rain and stop. Mr. Abootman, you seem to not understand how global weather patterns work.
Don't give me that fat cat fancy lip wiggling. Are you gonna let Canada save F1 or not?
Hot on the heels of the most boring F1 race of all time, it was up to Canada to save Formula One's reputation. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like the excitement in Montreal. 2 snooze fests in a row would be a disaster,
and the entire nation of Canada stepped up its game to keep that from happening. Somebody somewhere must be making wishes on a monkey's paw, because the Montreal Grand Prix was incredible from start to finish, yet it was still a Verstappen victory. Given that Monaco was the worst race of all time, but ended in a Leclerc victory, I have to surmise that this monkey's paw has 3 wishes left on it. And to whoever's making these wishes, I beg of you, please stop making wishes that affect Formula One. We've been lucky so far, but things could get ugly. Speaking of which, George Russell described his race as
ugly race on my behalf. Ugly race on my behalf. I'm sorry for that.
And he was right. It was his race to lose. And he did.
If you ain't first, you're last.
But here's the crazy part. He still finished ahead of the $500 million man. As much as I would have loved to see George win this race, I'm not even mad that Max won. In fact, I enjoy watching this type of skill expression, where a top-tier athlete competes at a disadvantage and triumphs anyway. I don't hate Max Verstappen. What I hate is boredom. Watching Max zoom off into the distance puts me to sleep faster than a YouTuber tapping on books. But when he has to turn it on, like truly turn it on and show everyone why he's the best driver on the grid, that does it for me. I don't care if he wins every race, if every time it's a close competition that's decided on skill alone. That's racing. And it wasn't just the Grand Prix in Montreal that was great. The whole weekend was exciting thanks in large part to the changing weather conditions. Yes, even Canada's geography had to step up to help save F1. For qualifying, it was merely the threat of changing weather conditions that added a lot of pressure to the drivers to get out there and put in hot laps. So instead of a typical session where a lot of them hang out in the garage and wait until the last moment to go out, we saw all the cars on track for the whole session, trying to get in as many hot laps as possible, chasing the track evolution before something happened to prevent that, like rain or someone hitting the wall, both of which were very real looming threats. The grid has never been tighter, and you can see that reflected in the qualifying results. Less than 0.3 of a second separated the top 7 drivers in qualifying, with the top 2 getting the exact same result down to 3 digits. No one felt safe. Except Sergio Perez. He was safe in the sense that he just signed a new contract, so he didn't need to show up. And he didn't. Going out in Q1 while Max put in the fastest lap in the same car. I've had coworkers like Checo, the kind that work their asses off while they're on probation, and then do the bare minimum as soon as their job is permanent. Okay, wait, that's not fair. Checo didn't even do the bare minimum and get the car out of Q1. And while Checo was taking a big number 2, Red Bull's number 2 team saw both drivers make it all the way to Q3, and they both finished ahead of Checo in the Grand Prix, who spent most of the race in the bottom 4 only to DNF. And you might think that's bad until you take a look at Scuderia Ferrari. They played it safe in one of the most competitive quali sessions of all time, with both drivers getting knocked out by just 2 to 3 tenths. A difference that could very well have been made up through the use of a new set of soft tires, a compound they wouldn't even end up using in the race. And even if they had, it wouldn't have mattered, as Leclerc's engine made like Carlos Sainz and torpedoed itself out of the race. I reached Fred Vasseur for comment, and he said, "Having our Monegasque driver win his home race was ecstasy, and Canada was the ecstasy hangover." And for everyone who gets that reference, how's that mid-30s depression treating you? Surely it can't be as depressing as what happened to Kevin Magnussen, a man who charged up the field gaining nearly 9 positions thanks to being on the extreme wets, who then pit at the exact correct moment only for his pit crew to not be ready with the new tires, costing him roughly 5 positions in a race where he was finally outperforming his teammate for once. Over in the other Haas, things were going just as poorly, if not worse, for Hülkenberg, who ended up staying out on the extreme wets for too long and lost all of the time that he had made up. By the end of the race, they finished 11th and 12th. If either of these drivers had had their race go even slightly better, they would have been in the points, which was devastating for the team. But it did bring one man a lot of joy. In lighter news, there were 2 drivers who had unexpectedly good results, and here to talk about them is the Canadian positivity guy. Jacques Villeneuve, a man who lives by the credo, "You're not wrong, you're just an asshole," is being credited for inspiring Daniel Ricciardo to prove him wrong today. During FP3, Villeneuve asked why Danny is still on the grid, saying that he's only beaten a burnt-out Vettel and an 18-year-old Verstappen, then never beat anyone ever again. Villeneuve conveniently forgot about Danny demolishing both Ocon and Hülkenberg at Renault, the same way Canada's conveniently forgotten that Jacques Villeneuve exists. Sure, he's the 1997 world champion and Canada's only F1 world champion, but he only won in 1997 because the Michael got a bit murdery. And after he stopped racing, he wasn't even a good DJ. He had to buy his own nightclub just to get gigs. Crediting him with Daniel Ricciardo's performance in the Grand Prix feels a lot like giving me credit for Lance Stroll's performance. I'm constantly dunking on the guy for not being good enough, and also hoping he steps up his game. It's the same reason I teabag in video games. I'm being disrespectful because I believe my opponent needs to up their game. I'm trying to inspire them to find it within themselves to stop the disrespect and prove me wrong. I just realized I'm more like Jacques Villeneuve than I cared to admit. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. This week, for the poll of the week, I asked, be honest, before this weekend, did you know how ties in qualifying were broken? And roughly 1/3 of you admitted, no you didn't, and the other 2/3 of you are filthy stinking liars. And now, for everyone who made it to the end of the video, here's the spicy joke of the week. Having a race this exciting to watch was a godsend for me because I hurt my back recently and was bedridden on race day. It was a welcome distraction from the feeling of lying in bed, trying to push through the pain, and contemplating whether I want to even live anymore. Or as I like to call it, the feeling of being Charles Leclerc. Having a race like Montreal right after Monaco feels a lot like winning the lottery 2 weeks after you declared bankruptcy. And I'm happy to say, I called it! Right after Monaco, I'm not sure which phrase I heard more over the past weekend. Is Red Bull dominance finally over? Or, hawk tour?
You gotta give him that hawk tour and spit on that thing, you get me?
Welcome to Race Weekend Update. The Orange Army is gonna love this one, because I'm about to spit on that thing. Before the Spanish Grand Prix, Max Verstappen said, "Our era of dominance is over." And then he proceeded to bring home yet another victory. There's never been much question that Max would be the favorite to win here, but it seems like the moment someone other than Max does well in qualifying, we have to spend the whole weekend listening to all the pundits speculate on Red Bull dominance being over. It's getting old. I understand why they do it. Not only would it be good for the sport, and they want it to be true, but also they want to be able to say they called it first. Well, I'm going to call this first. As far as results are concerned, Max is going to continue to dominate this season right until the end. But that doesn't mean I think this is going to be a boring season. Far from it. I'm not a Max Verstappen fan, but I do respect the man. And part of that respect is knowing that if he has a car that can win, he will win. The Spanish Grand Prix was a fantastic example of how I expect the rest of this season to go. Lando Norris is a great driver, and he did a great job putting the car on pole and turning that into a podium. But he had a car that could have won the race, and he didn't. Red Bull went out there with a car that wasn't necessarily the fastest, and they won anyway. Why is that? Well, for starters, Red Bull rarely fumbles strategy, and Max rarely makes mistakes. He had a bit of a moment going into turn 7 early on, but he managed to hold it and it didn't affect his race. And that was the full extent of Max's errors. He also has top-tier race strategist Hannah Schmitz in his corner, making sure the strategy they executed gave him the best opportunity to win. So by the end, Lando may have been closing, but he was never within striking distance. Just one mistake from the driver, pit crew, or the strategists would have cost Red Bull the race. But, yet again, everyone did their job competently. This may seem like a pretty simple ask, but it is actually insane to see a team so consistently operating with so few operational weaknesses. Ferrari could have never executed a strategy with such expert timing. Mercedes didn't have the pace in their car, and even if they did, George would have somehow ended up ahead of Lewis and then made one large race-losing blunder. As for McLaren, one could argue that Lando only lost because he got held up behind Russell in the first stint, which cost him about 4 seconds. But Max found himself in a similar position and managed to get past quick enough to put victory on the table. This is the difference between a great driver like Lando Norris and the best driver. When push comes to shove, Max makes it happen, and Red Bull makes sure the team isn't putting any obstacles in his way. After 2023, we all knew Max could win in the fastest car. But right now, while the car isn't dominant, Max and the team are picking up the slack. This must be making the other teams feel very inadequate. Like when your single friend who's always ripped gets injured and it turns out he's still way more attractive than you, even with a dad bod. When you're up against the whole package, even if they start to slip up in one area, everything else makes up for it. So you have to up your game across the board. For Max fans, this must feel incredible. Right now, nobody can argue that Newey's rocket ship is doing all the work. By having Perez in the other car, finishing in the midfield every race, they've shown that the car itself isn't enough to finish near the front. And even though Red Bull hasn't been the fastest car at every track recently, Max is still up 69 points over second place. He could skip 2 races at this point and still be comfortably in the lead. Yet he is still out there every race, fighting for those fine margins that make the difference between a podium and victory. Yes, 2024 is truly going to be Max's hot girl summer. He's going to carry the team to yet another victory, and he's going to do it early. But I'm not saying this is going to be boring. Quite the contrary. In 2023, when Max was just driving off into the distance, winning every race by over 30 seconds without even having to try, that was boring. In large part, that was thanks to the car being so much better than the rest, so there wasn't much competition. But this season, I think, will be Max's best, even though he's not going to set any records. If it pans out the way I think it will, 2024 will be the season where Max proves why he's the greatest, or GOATed, as the younger fans would say. It feels like a TV show where the protagonist constantly has his back up against the wall, yet always finds a way to win in the end. And I'm here for it. I'll make the comparison to Sebastian Vettel. What was his greatest season? Was it 2013 when he and the RB9 joined forces to dominate a season so hard that the records would stand for a decade? Or was it the season where he won by just a few points, having never led the Drivers' Championship up until he won it? I would argue that the victory is sweeter when the win wasn't certain. There is little sport in a foregone conclusion, and right now, each race is anything but a foregone conclusion. I can already hear you saying, "But wait a minute, didn't you just say that Max is going to be winning? And if you can predict that he's going to win, isn't that going to be boring? But then you said it wouldn't be boring." Well, yes. Not only is he going to win, but the results are going to make it look like it was yet another dominant season. The difference is that he'll be winning each race with pure skill. For the rest of this season, I expect Verstappen to rock up to each race with a minor disadvantage, or at best, a car that is on par with the fastest on the track. And I expect him to win. But in order for him to win, he's going to have to give it everything. He's going to drive his balls off every race. I expect him to have to try his hardest at all times, to do whatever it takes to win, and to squeak out those victories by just a few seconds at the most. This is going to be the season where Max picks up a lot of new fans. People hate watching someone dunk on the competition for years on end. But when you've got one of the greatest sportsmen of all time showing up and winning by the skin of his teeth consistently, that's what wins hearts. Something Max has struggled with historically. There were multiple races this season where Max should have been the driver of the day, but the people just don't want to vote for him. And I think that's because when Max was going out there in a car that was by far the best on the grid, all he had to do was beat Checo. He didn't really have to put in much effort. And people aren't impressed when you win when you have an advantage. But right now, while he's being put to the test without an advantage, he's showing he's the real deal. He's not holding back. He is finally being challenged and he's rising to the occasion, consistently coming out on top by the slimmest of margins. I said it last week and I'll say it again. Now this is racing. But even better, I can see the fire burning within him again. When Max was clapping the whole grid, he would win and just say, "Haha, very lovely, nice day at the office." But now that he's working hard for it, you can actually hear that he feels like he's winning again. I said in a previous video that he couldn't win anymore. And what I meant by that is that he couldn't experience that feeling of winning anymore because his wins were hollow. They were expected. Winning didn't feel like an achievement. It felt like meeting expectations. But now when Max wins, there's excitement. He finally feels like he's accomplished something when he goes out there. Something more than merely doing what is expected of him. He's competing at the highest level, sometimes at a disadvantage, and winning. As far as athletes are concerned, the best feeling in the world is demonstrating that you are the best at what you do. And right now, Max Verstappen is proving unequivocally that he is the best at what he does. I grew up with the Michael dominating Formula One, then it was Red Bull and Vettel, and then Lewis and Mercedes. For all of them, there would be seasons where the car did the heavy lifting and they went basically unchallenged. And then there were years where a challenger would get close, but, insert champion here, would win the ship by the slimmest of margins. And it should be obvious which seasons were more enjoyable to watch. The historians and statisticians love to fawn over the seasons like 2023 and 2013 where all the records were broken, calling them some of the greatest of all time because the numbers were so dramatic. But the racing wasn't. The achievements look good in a nice infographic and stand out when featured prominently in your coffee table book, but those seasons suck ass to watch. Only the die-hard fans of the guy who's winning enjoy that. And what they're enjoying is not good racing. They're enjoying being able to talk shit and put down the haters. Luckily for us, that's not what this season is shaping up to be. The seasons like we're having now, where there's a clear favorite to win, but he only just barely wins every time, these are the good times in a period of dominance. The silver linings, the good racing that nobody will remember because the name at the top of the sheet at the end of the race was still Max Verstappen. If you're still watching F1 this season, then there's a pretty good chance that you're not a fair weather F1 fan. The sport shed a lot of those over the past 24 months. It's only us connoisseurs who are able to see that what the racing is right now is a very rare vintage. It's a Verstappen victory steeped in competition, aged in the tightest pack ever, with the occasional hint of Alonso in the tannins. And you know how I know this is good racing? Because I trust your judgment, the viewer. And when I asked you in the poll of the week to give the race in Spain a letter grade, half of you gave it an A or a B, with the vast majority of people giving it a C. And almost nobody gave it a D or an F. And I have heard that nobody is smarter than the audience. And I do agree, because you're here, so I know you're expecting that thing that I usually tuck away at the end of the video. And here to give it to you is the Canadian Positivity Guy with the spicy joke of the week. George Russell was hot out the gate with a strong performance at the start, but he lost his momentum when he stopped too early and couldn't recover from there, so he ended up crying from disappointment. Which, ironically, is also how your mom would describe the last time we hooked up. Max Verstappen feels threatened by Lando Norris, and the way he's racing proves it. This is my thesis statement. Welcome to Race Weekend Update, a safe place for people with spicy F1 opinions. For the first 50 laps of the Austrian Grand Prix, I found myself questioning whether or not there would even be something worth making a video about. The sprint was uneventful, quali was whatever, and the race was mediocre right up until Max's slow for Red Bull but fast for Sauber pit stop. I'll be honest, the Grand Prix was not doing a great job of holding my attention this morning. I'm going through some shit in my personal life right now, and a great Formula One race like we had in Canada or Spain was exactly what I needed to get my mind off of things. But instead we got 50 laps of whatever, which left me alone with my thoughts. Not good.
Let's do something really scary. We could go to bed early and be alone with our thoughts.
I kept glancing over, hoping to find something to draw me back into the race, and then suddenly I saw that Lando was within DRS range? What? Didn't Max have a 6-second lead? Turns out I missed Max's 6.5-second pit stop, which put Lando's McLaren right on his ass. Lando catching Max was exactly what this race needed. He kept dive bombing the corners, and then something happened that I didn't expect. Max started defending aggressively, like Ocon tier aggression. I think it was Will Buxton who described Max as having razors on his elbows. We haven't seen Max defending like this since the early days of 2022, before Leclerc went limp. And I think I know why. When Max had a car that was very clearly dominant, he backed off the aggression and was much more focused on keeping his car intact. It didn't matter if someone got past him briefly, he could wait for a safe opportunity and pass later. He always knew he had the pace in hand to reclaim any lost positions. A lot of people, myself included, saw this as Max maturing and calming down. We thought his driving style was relaxing into something less aggressive and more focused on minimizing errors. Well, we were right that he was calming down, but as it turns out, he still has that dog in him. And not only did he let it out today, he released the hounds.
Release the hounds.
You see, Max isn't just a great driver. He's the best, which means that his driving style is incredibly adaptive. When he was in the best car, he took it easy, managed the pace, didn't take unnecessary risks, and as a result, he went 2 years without a DNF. Now that the car advantage is gone and he sees another driver challenging his position at the front, he's got razor blades on his elbows and is sending a message. You shall not pass! One of the things that sets world champions apart is that they do whatever it takes to win, even if it's unsavory. Schumacher was known for being unyielding, and even Senna had a reputation for putting himself into positions where he would leave it up to the other driver as to whether or not they crash. This of course makes them unpopular with the other drivers, but they do it for one simple reason. They want to instill fear in their competition. They want other drivers to know, I will not yield, and if you challenge me, then we'll both be out. You don't see this kind of behavior from someone who believes they have the championship comfortably in hand. You never saw Lewis acting like that when his closest challenger was Bottas, but when he was up against Rosberg, Alonso, and Verstappen, he bared his fangs and made it clear he was not going to play nice. There were a lot of questions after the race as to how this will affect Lando and Max's relationship, but the reality is, no friendship can survive a title fight. Max got a 10-second penalty for the incident and didn't seem all that bothered by it in the post-race interviews. But Lando was visibly upset. He even said it was up to Max to say something because it was Max who was in the wrong. But if he's waiting for an apology, he's not going to get one. Why? Because I'm pretty sure Max's actions were fully intentional and achieved their intended result. Sending a message to the man he perceives as a threat. You will never get a heartfelt apology from someone who intentionally wronged you. And even if you do, it will always ring hollow. If Lando hasn't learned this lesson already, he will by the end of the year. The definition of jealous is fiercely protective or vigilant of one's rights or possessions, and frankly, I think Max sees this year's championship as rightfully his. So now that it's potentially under threat, he's jealously guarding it. You don't put on that desperate of a defense unless you are concerned about losing. And as the Verstappen family credo goes, if you ain't first, you're last. I can't imagine that Lando's dad is the only winners get rides home type. But now that he's up against a man who was taught that winning is everything from birth, he seems genuinely taken aback by his friend's unexpected ruthlessness. Lando is quite clearly a sensitive guy, and I feel for him. But he's going to have to steel his heart for what's to come if he's ever going to challenge Max for a title. Personally, I come from a niche sporting background. I helped build dodgeball into a sport. I was part of that journey taking it from recreational to competitive the way other sports did a century ago. I got to watch people go from having friendly sporting attitudes to realizing they need to leave that all behind if they ever want to win a world championship. They say demons run when a good man goes to war. And right now, Lando needs to decide if he wants to remain a good man or go to war. I'll draw a comparison to another sensitive man, one who is famous for being in touch with his emotions, but also a world champion. No, not Seb. He didn't get empathy until after he was done winning championships. I'm talking about Lewis Hamilton. He wears his heart on his sleeve, but he also knows when to get hard, so to speak. When Max was pushing the limits in 2021, Lewis stopped yielding and let it play out. If you watched the press conferences, you could tell this was not how he wanted to race. But he also knew if he gave Max an inch, he'd take a mile. And as I always say, the people you give the most leniency, fuck you the hardest. So he got on his level, and the two of them just let the halo do its job, saving both of them from certain death as a result of their attitudes. On multiple occasions. And as far as friendships are concerned, when Lewis was up against childhood friend Nico Rosberg for championships, he gave up the friendship to get the championship. And the friendship never recovered. That's what Lando has to come to terms with if he's going to get on Max's level, because there is no question that Max would walk from their friendship if it secured the title for him. Speaking of burning bridges, we have the Canadian positivity guy here with the Canadian summary of the Grand Prix. All you chuds keep flapping your lips about Max and Lando's bromance, but I couldn't care less. What stood out to me about today's race was the podium full of second drivers. What is it going to take for George to finally get some respect? Russell is the only one who seems to be able to win in that Mercedes, yet everyone keeps fawning over Lewis because of his past achievements. And don't get me started on Sainz. At one point, there was a 23-month period where he was the only driver to have beaten Verstappen, and he did so twice. Yet somehow, he's the second driver getting kicked out so Ferrari can hire the number 2 performing driver at Mercedes. Literally, the only guy getting any respect on that podium is Piastri, and that's because people still have Schmilt tier expectations for him. It's actually incredible how similar these guys are. They've all got the jam, but are overshadowed by their 10-ply Sally of a teammate. So for today, let's Sally these guys who managed to wheel and snipe their way onto the podium while the big shoots shat the bed. Cheers! And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. For the poll of the week, this week I asked, how do you typically watch an F1 race? Not gonna lie, I wasn't expecting these results. For starters, barely anyone watches at a bar or public place, which I guess is fair enough. The commentary adds a lot, and without it, the experience would be lacking. But I was even more surprised at how few people watch with literally anyone else. Nearly 70% of respondents said that they watch by themselves, which definitely makes me wonder if that loneliness is why F1 Twitter and comment sections are so toxic. Being alone sucks, so maybe it's time to wrangle up a group of friends and start watching together. At least that way, when you have a really spicy comment, you don't have to share it with the whole world. Just your friend who can tell that you're not frothing at the mouth and won't be offended. And on that note, it's time for the spicy joke of the week. Haas scored 12 points, catapulting them into 7th place in the Constructors' Championship. Finishing 6th and 8th, it was their best result in years. But even more impressive was that they managed to do it while spit roasting a Red Bull. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please send this to a friend who might enjoy it. Sergio Perez is currently on track to get 8th place in the Drivers' Championship, and I think it's high time that Red Bull deals with him the way McLaren dealt with Daniel Ricciardo, by buying out his contract. And who do I think Red Bull should get to Piastri Perez in this pantomime? Ironically, Daniel Ricciardo. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, kind of like Checo's tenure at Red Bull. Hot on the heels of the Silverstone Grand Prix, 2024 has become an incredibly exciting season. The pack is tighter than it's ever been, which means that the championships will be won or lost on fine margins. Being off the pace by just a couple tenths can mean the difference between starting near the front or deep into the midfield. And unfortunately for Perez, he's just not known for finding those extra tenths in qualifying. In fact, one could argue that Checo is a Mr. Sunday, a man who's known for his racecraft and also for being the Mexican Minister of Defense and the patron saint of tire management. But with all those things combined, it's pretty clear that he put all of his skill points into talents that help him on race day. It's why he's one of only 6 drivers in history to pull a last to first victory in Formula One. There is no question that Checo can handle himself in a Grand Prix. But that just isn't enough anymore. In the current era, you can't afford to botch quali, because even if you nail it, you might still lose out on positions by a few hundredths or even thousandths, so you can't leave anything on the table. We know that Max likes a car with a twitchy rear end, and whoever drives the car alongside him has to leave a little bit of margin so they don't spin out, because their ass can't sense oversteer the way Max's can. But there just isn't space for that kind of buffer anymore. And given the recent gains in pace from McLaren and Mercedes, even Max can't guarantee that he can make up positions in the Grand Prix anymore. In Silverstone, he started 4th and ended 2nd thanks to George's mechanical DNF. So realistically, he only made up a single position. Given Max's talent and synergy with the car, there is no reason to believe that Checo could do any better. And he didn't. And he hasn't been. He started from the pit lane and ended in 17th. But once you remove the 2 DNFs, that means he only finished ahead of a single car. That's not good enough. If you find yourself thinking, these criticisms sound suspiciously similar to the ones Daniel Ricciardo received at McLaren, you'd be correct. And you'd also be right to wonder why I still want to see him swapped into Red Bull as soon as possible. And I'll get to that. But first, let's rewind to 2023, when Checo was still consistently falling short in qualifying, but the car was good enough to allow him to make up the difference on race day. He had the car underneath him to make his way back up the grid and finished 2nd place in the WDC. Barely. Lewis managed to give him a run for his money in a seriously inferior car, and that's what opened up the door for Danny Ric to start sniffing around again. 2024 started off looking like it was going to be Red Bull dominance all over again, and we all felt it. I even made a video about how repetitive F1 was getting, but I never released it because that all ended after 4 races. We have now had 6 different winners, and we're only halfway into the season. It's a great time to be watching Formula One because anybody could end up on top of the podium. In fact, people are even able to enjoy Verstappen victories now that they're not a guarantee. But this makes things even worse for Perez because he didn't make the best of those first races when his car was still the best on the grid. And he's now on a solid trajectory to take 8th place in the WDC as both Mercedes drivers are poised to pass him in the next race or two. 8th place! In the same car as the guy who's almost certainly going to win the whole shebang. The only thing more embarrassing than that would be... Well, I wanted to write a punchline for that, but I actually genuinely couldn't think of anything. If you can think of something more embarrassing than that, let me know in the comments. What I find more astonishing than Perez's poor performance is Red Bull's choice to renew his contract so early this season. At the time they re-signed Checo, Yuki was killing it, but I understand why they don't want to put Yuki in the top team. He's toxic and almost certainly ended any chance he had of being Max's teammate when he swerved at Danny earlier this year. Anybody who can get that toxic with a sweetheart like Ricciardo is almost certainly going to poison the well as soon as he's put alongside someone as cold, aggressive, and unforgiving as Max Verstappen. And Red Bull knows this. Honestly, I think that's why they chose to keep Checo. Perez poses no threat to Verstappen, and given the recent internal power struggles at Red Bull, signing Sergio over Sainz feels a lot more like political maneuvering. They wanted to show Max that he's still clearly number 1 and won't be challenged. And it'll also help him secure the WDC this season, as he won't be up against someone who will be putting their car ahead of him. But is this a smart move for Red Bull? If all you care about is retaining your top talent, then yes, it is. They will almost certainly be celebrating Max's Drivers' Championship before the season is over, but it may come at the cost of the Constructors' Championship. Red Bull currently leads Ferrari by 71 points, and McLaren by 78. McLaren has been crushing it recently, and both their drivers are filling their boots while they have all this pace in hand. Lando has been lauded as Max's newest challenger, and it's only a matter of time before Piastri wins his first race. He's not a rookie anymore, and his performance proves it. Speaking of Oscars-worthy performances, as you may recall, McLaren spent millions of dollars to bench the underperforming has-been that was Daniel Ricciardo and Papaya to put Piastri in that seat, and that gamble has been paying off. If Danny Ric was still at McLaren performing the way Checo is at Red Bull, McLaren wouldn't even be in the discussion for the Constructors' Championship. Yet, here they are, firing on all cylinders ready to take the fight to Max. I say to Max instead of to Red Bull, because Max is single-handedly keeping Red Bull in this fight, and Perez is single-handedly keeping Red Bull close enough to McLaren for them to catch up. The last time Perez finished outside the midfield was in Miami when he took 4th, and his last podium was in China. This type of garbage tier performance is why McLaren sacked Ricciardo. Red Bull might as well not even be entering a second car at this point. One could argue that he's doing more damage than good by showing off the Red Bull floor all the time. I think it gives Red Bull the license to do something drastic, because at this point, it would be hard to find someone who could do worse. Following Silverstone, Checo is 137 points behind his teammate, and if the rumors are to be believed, his contract stipulates that he needs to be within 100 points of Max by Monza, or he loses his contract. If that's true, it means he has just 4 races to close a 37-point gap with the best driver on the grid, and no mechanical advantage. He could win all 4 races, and it wouldn't matter if Max still got second place, which you know he would if the car is capable of winning. So there's a lot of debate as to who should go into the second Red Bull. I've already said why I don't think it'll be Yuki, and there are a lot of other good options like Liam Lawson, but I can make a great case for putting Danny Ric in it. And the reasons may surprise you. We all know Christian Horner loves Daniel Ricciardo, at least as much as he loves sending uncomfortable text messages to his employees. Horner is the primary reason the 35-year-old has a seat in the junior team when that really should have gone to Liam Lawson. or stayed with Nick de Vries, but let's not get into that. I don't feel like crying today. Daniel Ricciardo was once the hotness that everyone touted as a future world champion, but he saw Red Bull lining up behind Verstappen and cast out on his own to find a team that would throw their support behind him. He found it at Renault, and then left for greener pastures at McLaren, but just couldn't gel with the car. It's obvious at this point that he lacks adaptability and needs a car that drives like a Red Bull to get the most out of it. Does this mean he deserves a shot at Red Bull? As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't. But as much as he doesn't deserve the Red Bull seat, I think he deserves that V-carb seat even less. Red Bull shouldn't be allowed to own two teams. And the only reason they've been able to get away with it up until this point was because one was a junior team. You can't keep up that pretense when you've had one of those drivers for 4 years and the other one is a 35-year-old with over 13 years of experience. Danny Ric's seat rightfully belongs to a junior driver, and I want to see him out of it. The only reason he's in that seat in the first place is because he jumped in the RB19 during a tire test and set a lap that was on par with Max's pole lap at the same track in the same car. He showed he still has the pace when the pressure's off, but does that mean he can do the same thing under pressure? No, but obviously the possibility is still there. And I'm tired of hearing about the guy and how he might take Checo's seat. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a toilet seat, and they need to shit or get off the pot. It's time to put Danny in the Red Bull and put all the speculation to rest. There is literally no downside to this. If Danny does well, then Red Bull gets a huge win. He almost certainly will get along better with Max, given their prior friendship when they were teammates before, and it's a massive PR win. Most importantly though, we can see if Danny is truly washed, or if he actually was just in the wrong car all this time. We can move on from hearing about Perez, Lawson can get the drive he deserves, and by the end of this season, if Danny isn't performing, Red Bull can make a properly informed decision about who they want in their second car. By the end of this season, there will be no question as to whether Danny still got it or if it's time for him to move on. And I am so ready to move on from speculating about Daniel Ricciardo and the second Red Bull seat. The proof will be in the performance. But if the proof is in the performance, then there's no excusing Checo being 137 points behind his teammate. And here to talk about that is the Canadian Positivity Guy. In the last 20 years, my country has produced 2 Formula One drivers, and both of them were billionaire nepo babies who didn't deserve their seat. Nicholas Latifi was never F1 tier, but a really great guy, and Lance Stroll has flashes of competence, but is still very clearly not good enough for a driver of his experience. We're on year 7 of Lance being in F1, and he's only scored 34% of his team's points. Sure, he's up against Fernando Alonso, but the consensus across the board from everyone who talks about the sport is it's time for him to move on. So what does that say about a driver who's only scored 31% of his team's points? That's right, I'm also dunking on Checo. The fact that I can say Lance Stroll is outperforming Sergio Perez in any metric is the harshest criticism I can lay at his feet. If Sergio Perez was a social movement, he'd be quiet quitting. If he was a browser, he'd be Internet Explorer. If Checo was a sex move, he'd be starfishing. This week, for the poll of the week, I asked, who's winning in Silverstone? Roughly a quarter of respondents said Lewis, another quarter said Max, and a third said Lando, which leaves only 10% choosing George Russell, even though he was on pole and won the race just before this. Honestly, this fits perfectly with the public perception of George Russell. He's not a closer. He doesn't get things done. He can snipe a victory when he's in the right place at the right time, but even before he started losing his coolant in Silverstone, he'd already lost his grip on the victory. I'm happy for Lewis, but more than anything, I'm bummed for George. This guy can't get any respect, and despite his immense talent, he often fumbles whenever he has the opportunity to take a victory on pure merit. It's just easier to believe in Max or Lando or even Lewis because those guys are consistent in their pace and rarely make big mistakes the way George does. Lando Norris may be McLaren's golden boy right now, but he has an exceptional young teammate who's almost on world championship form. And that's why I think Lando is likely to do the Danny dip and jump ship to another team as soon as 2026. No driver would be happy about team orders to hand the victory to a teammate they are 5 seconds ahead of. But I want to be clear about something. I don't think Norris is scared of Piastri. In fact, I might even be able to convince you that him leaving McLaren would be a good idea. So stick around to the end, and if I haven't convinced you by then, you can deconstruct all of my arguments in the comments. This is the Danny Dip. Ever since Oscar joined McLaren, I've had this sneaking suspicion that he was going to usurp the team out from under Lando. I've bit my tongue on the subject for quite a while because speculating on a subject like this brings the haters out in droves. But now that there's trouble in paradise, I think it's time we seriously discuss why this is a real possibility. Formula One may be a team sport, but at the front of the grid, they follow the Sith rule of two. Two drivers, a master who has the power, and an apprentice to crave it and train under the master to one day fulfill their role. And as far as McLaren is concerned, we can actually trace the roots of their current situation all the way back to 2014. The first and most obvious example of the Danny Dip is ironically Sebastian Vettel jumping ship from Red Bull to Ferrari in 2015. One could argue that Seb was lured to Ferrari by Red Bull's poor form and the prospect of being like Mike, but it was also pretty clear that his young teammate was outperforming him, and if Red Bull could get their shit together and challenge for another title, Ricciardo would be the driver the team lined up behind. Vettel wasn't done holding the power of being lead driver, and I think that played a huge role in his dip to Ferrari. And in 2014, Ricciardo was quite possibly the best driver on the grid. So Danny did to Vettel what Vettel did to Webber. Showed up and stole the team out from underneath him. Actually, now that I think about it, this is a usurpers all the way down type situation. But Mark Webber didn't jump ship to another team. He lost motivation and retired, so not quite the same. Following Vettel's exit, Red Bull got really enamored with drivers named Danny and put the Russian Daniil Kvyat alongside the Australian Daniel they already had. But Russian Danny rubbed people the wrong way. And even though he scored 3 more points than Aussie Danny did in 2015, he was about to be cast aside for the new hotness in town. A 17-year-old Dutchman that we now know as the GOAT. But back then, he was just an awkward kid with a really wide mouth and exceptional racing skills. So just 4 races into 2016, Russian Danny got dropped, and Aussie Danny found himself in the position of master once again. But this time, with an apprentice who was much younger than him. At least he thought he held the power of lead driver. But soon, it became apparent the student was becoming the master. Danny may have finished 52 points ahead of Max in 2016, but you need to remember that Verstappen had 4 fewer races in a Red Bull than Danny did, so it's not really a fair comparison. Then in 2017, Danny beat Max 200 to 168, but the writing was already on the wall. By 2018, after the incident where Max rear-ended Danny and Ricciardo wasn't satisfied with the team's response, that's when we got to see Danny dip from Red Bull to Renault, in exchange for a dump truck full of money. Netflix portrayed this as the honey badger running from a fight, but that's not how I saw it. And I don't think Lando will be running from a fight either if he leaves McLaren. You have to keep in mind when Danny left for Renault, Red Bull had just signed a deal for Honda power units, and this was just 1 year after the famously failed partnership between Honda and McLaren that had Alonso calling it a GP2 engine. At this point in his career, Danny had experienced all of his success with Renault power units. They were familiar, a known quantity, offering him stability and the guarantee of being lead driver. And of course, importantly, their offer came with enough money to buy a nice house in Vancouver. That's a lot of money. All of these factors come into play when a driver who's considered a top talent feels like their position within the team is threatened. But most importantly, it creates an opportunity for other top teams to snatch up a hot commodity. When Ferrari picked up Seb, he actually helped bring them back to the front until he lost his mojo in 2018. And when Renault picked up Danny, he got them back on the podium again. But you might find yourself thinking, weren't both those drivers snatched up from teams that weren't at the front? So why would Lando want to leave McLaren? Simple. If he got an offer from a team like Red Bull or Mercedes. Rumors have been abound all season that Max might migrate to a Merc. And we already know that Lewis is doing the Danny dip to Ferrari for enough money to get Oprah's attention. And both of these teams are fighting at the front right now, so it wouldn't exactly be a step down for Lando. Horner has explicitly expressed interest in Lando in the past, And if Norris doesn't feel like his team is 100% behind him, I can see him accepting an offer from Red Bull to go be their number one driver. And Red Bull is a team that very clearly endorses one man to be their lead driver, a luxury that can only be afforded by a team that's fighting at the front. F1 teams are usually amicable when they're trashed here. Even up in the midfield, the drivers have to work together to get whatever points they can for the team, sometimes sacrificing their own race to help their teammate get a position they wouldn't be able to get on their own. Case in point, Alonso's masterclass defense that helped Ocon get his maiden victory in Hungary 3 years ago. But now that McLaren is at the front fighting for victories, the gloves are off and Piastri has stepped up. This isn't like when Danny dipped to McLaren and couldn't keep up. Oscar's move to McLaren has been a match made in heaven. He's a young talent who's constantly improving and is now fighting at the front, just like young Lando did many moons ago. But now the shoe is on the other foot. And while Lando has been at the top of his game, the top of his game hasn't been good enough. Multiple times, he has lost a race in the fastest car. Too often, we hear Lando telling the press afterwards that he made too many mistakes, that he should have got the victory, but didn't. And you may find yourself thinking, now hold on just a minute, Oscar was in the same car and he did even worse in most of those races. And outside of Hungary, you'd be right. But there's one key difference. This is only Oscar's second year in the sport. He's already going toe-to-toe with the greatest drivers on the grid and proving himself worthy of being called their competitor. Lando may still look like a child, but he's on his 6th year of being in Formula One. He's in his prime. At this point in time, we know what to expect from the man. A very high level of performance with a few mistakes here and there. So while he may be currently outperforming Piastri, Oscar is improving at an alarming rate and seems set to surpass him in the coming years. There is no arguing that Oscar is on an upward trajectory with no end in sight. Piastri is a consummate professional, and you don't hear the turmoil on the team radio between him and his race engineer that you do between Lando and his. Oscar shows up, does his job, does it well, and then goes to work the next day to go over his notes and do a better job next time. He's still benefiting from rookie gains. Since he's so new, it is much easier for him to improve than, say, someone who's been on the grid for many years. And that's why I can see McLaren wanting to make sure that he sticks around long term. If he has the capacity to outperform a driver as good as Lando, they want to make sure he's in a McLaren when he does it. So if the writing is on the wall, when do I think Lando would leave? Well, I can't see a world in which Lando leaves McLaren next year. Their car is just too good right now. But if the team dynamic is feeling iffy, the time to jump ship would be for the rules change in 2026. It's no guarantee they'll nail the new regulations. In fact, McLaren actually has a pretty poor record for nailing the new regs right away. Not to mention, Lando's stock has never been higher. He's finally got some wins under his belt, both literally and metaphorically. And if he wanted to literally cash in on his current performance, I'm sure there are tons of teams that would be willing to offer him dump trucks of money the way Renault did for Danny. But I personally don't think he would be too swayed by cash. Don't forget, he bought his way into the sport with daddy's money. If he wants tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, all he has to do is wait for his inheritance. No, what I think will sway Lando will be a team that has a history of hitting the ground running in a new rule set, along with the guarantee of being lead driver and enough money to flatter his ego. And the team that I can see doing that would be Red Bull if Max leaves, or Mercedes if he doesn't. Given how openly antagonistic Max has been with his team as of late, not to mention Mercedes' recent improvement in form, I wouldn't be surprised if Verstappen rage quit and went to Mercedes. And on that subject, the Canadian Positivity Guy is here to offer his opinion. World champion Max Verstappen has put on a masterclass of bitching on the radio. I haven't heard someone chirp their own team this hard since the last time I went to a Leafs game. But credit to Lambiase, he didn't take Max's beaking like a little bitch. He gave it right back. This is in stark contrast to McLaren, who went from asking Norris to let Piastri pass, to telling him, to begging him. Frankly, it was kinda sad. GP has a spine, and when his driver is being a whiny little prick, he reaches through the radio and slaps some sense back into him. On the other hand, McLaren's 10-ply race engineers have no idea how to handle a diva backdooring his own teammate. McLaren dropped the ball when they undercut their own driver to cover Hamilton, which was almost as dumb as Ricciardo pitting on lap 7 to cover Hamilton. These were both so stupid that I'm putting "to cover Hamilton" on my roster of nonsense phrases that I use when I need to justify doing something stupid. Right next to "this will ruin the tour." McLaren should not have been surprised when Lando big-timed them over the radio. Lando acted like a teenager who was trying to assert himself, but then he ended up backing down at the last moment, which might even be worse. If he really wanted to win, he could have handed the position back right away and then raced Oscar really hard right to the end. Honestly, it wouldn't have made that much difference if he had just held on to the lead and taken the victory. He'd already put everyone through all the turmoil, but at least he would have been able to close the gap to Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship, which in my opinion is a more defensible position. But this isn't just Lando's fault. It's all of McLaren. Oscar for not catching up, and the team for the schmelt tier strategy. This is the kind of shit that causes your star player to consider a transfer. So I have just one piece of advice for McLaren. Give your balls a tug, tit. And now, for the poll of the week. I asked, which McLaren driver will score more points in 2025? 21% said Oscar Piastri, and 79% said Lando Norris. This just goes to show that public sentiment is still very firmly in Lando's corner. And rightly so. He still leads his teammate by a fair margin and continues to catch Max. There was some speculation that Max was off his form because he stayed up late sim racing, but it doesn't matter. He could take the next 3 races off, and Lando could win all 3, and Max would still be 1 point ahead. And that, right there, is the number one reason McLaren should have let Lando take the win. If they want any chance of one of their drivers taking the WDC this season, they need to throw all of their weight behind Norris. The only reason not to do that is because you're trying to keep Oscar happy long term. But in doing so, they may be giving Lando license to start sniffing around for other teams that will be willing to make the hard decision and endorse a single driver for the win. And let's be real, Lando is the only driver with a realistic chance of catching Max this season. So Carlos Sainz is going to Williams for 2025. After all that song and dance about trying to find the best car in the short term, something with championship winning capabilities, he signs with the 9th place team. This might seem a lot like your friend who recently got unexpectedly divorced, saying he was going to take his time and be really picky about choosing his next life partner, only to show up a few weeks later with a 50-year-old stripper on his arm who you can tell used to be really hot, but hasn't been an attractive prospect in over a decade. Let's talk about that. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like the silly season in 2024. Carlos Sainz has been performing at an exceptional level for a couple years now. There was a stretch of 21 races where he was the only driver to beat Verstappen, and he did it twice. You'd think that he'd be a hot commodity that Ferrari would want to hold on to, but it's not often that a 7-time world champion is willing to jump teams, and we all know Ferrari wasn't about to sack their golden boy. So they kicked Carlos to the curb, and his rebound to Williams is baffling on the surface, but the implications of this move are actually quite intriguing. For starters, he signed a multi-year deal, which, as far as I can tell, is for 2025 and 2026. This means Williams showed him something that makes him confident they have something up their sleeves for the new regulations. If they didn't, he probably would have only taken a 1-year deal and continued to try to find a better team for 2026. Now, this is complete speculation, but I think that Vowles probably showed him a new hire that gave him the confidence to throw his lot in with Williams over the other teams that were courting him. And I have a wild guess as to who that is, but before I make that speculation, let me set the scene. We know for a fact that Sainz was in talks with Red Bull, but they weren't able to offer him Audi money. And Red Bull also seems to be on the decline. Their car is no longer dominant, even in the hands of the best driver on the grid, and their internal politics seem to be tearing the team apart from the inside. It's also no secret that Audi wanted Sainz, but couldn't convince him, and I don't blame him for balking at their offer. They can throw all the money in the world at him, but while Sauber keeps slipping further behind the pack, they are a massive gamble, and almost certainly not going to help him achieve his short-term goal of being in a winning car. Not to mention that Audi's new built-from-scratch engine is a huge unknown factor in this equation. Carlos has been incredibly picky and really taken his time trying to find a new seat. So this move to Williams comes as a shock given that they only have 4 points more than Sauber, which gives them a grand total of 4 points. I don't get the impression that Carlos was desperate to find a team for next season. So I think Williams made a huge $105 million pickup,
and James disclosed who that was to get Sainz to sign with them. If you recognize that number, it's probably because that's the amount of money that Adrian Newey's new contract with an undisclosed team is worth. From what I've been able to find, someone senior at Ferrari kiboshed bringing Newey on board, and just a few days ago, David Coulthard declared that Adrian would go to Aston Martin, but Newey's manager, Eddie Jordan, said DC's comments were inaccurate and fanciful. Great choice of words, Eddie. Only time will tell if I'm right, but for Williams to get a driver who is in talks with a front-running team like Red Bull, who claims to be more concerned with getting a winning car than a huge paycheck, I can see Sainz following the Kingmaker to whatever team he signs with. I also think Williams would be appealing to Adrian for numerous reasons. For starters, during his last stint with Williams, Newey was promised a lot of authority that he did not receive, in areas such as choosing the drivers. This could be a great opportunity for Newey to get a do-over at the team he once made champions. And I can see Vowles, unlike Frank Williams, actually respecting the agreements he makes. So it's also possible that, if Newey has signed with Williams, that he actually had some input into the courting and signing of Carlos Sainz. And let's not forget the Vowles factor. James Vowles is an obscenely intelligent and incredibly charismatic leader. He was a key part of Mercedes' success in the turbo hybrid era, and he's been pulling Williams up by their bootstraps with no signs of stopping. He seems intent on restoring Williams to their former glory, and that kind of person attracts top talent, which is why I believe it's even possible for the backmarker team to pick up key players like Newey and Sainz. But even if Williams didn't get Newey, there's another factor that makes them more appealing than Audi: their engine. Williams is supposedly sticking with Mercedes power units until 2030, and Mercedes engines are a pretty safe bet. They're currently powering the fastest car on the grid, McLaren, as well as Aston Martin, who last year, at times, were outperforming the Works team itself. This bodes well for Mercedes customer teams, showing that Merc is a great engine supplier who is able to work with their customers to help them produce a fast overall package, something we don't see with, say, Ferrari, for example. So on the surface, it might seem like Sainz showed up with a rebound, but it may turn out that he's actually the gold digger, and that old woman on his arm actually has a massive inheritance coming in from her wealthy uncle Red Bull. And now that we've speculated on why he made the move, let's talk about the implications of this announcement. It's a well-known fact that Carlos Sainz was the cork in the bottle for this year's drivers' market, which means that silly season is about to kick into full gear for the summer break. Or more accurately, it can finally wrap up. With Ocon's recent signing with Haas and Hulk with Audi, there aren't that many seats left. Mercedes needs to announce their number 2, as does Audi, Alpine, and whatever the hell Red Bull wants to call their second team next year. The remaining drivers without a contract are Bottas, Magnussen, Zhou, Sargent, and Ricciardo. I think it's pretty likely that Sauber keeps Bottas for some stability and a point of reference, and also because he's actually pretty good, but I don't see Kevin, Logan, or Guan Yu getting seats. One thing I'm really happy about, though, is this means Daniel Ricciardo is not going to Williams. He doesn't have a contract, and a lot of people thought he might snatch up Sargent's seat. But now that that's off the table, I think he might get a shot at Sergio's seat.
It is impossible to say definitively who is the best Formula One driver of all time, but I can say, objectively, it is dishonest to exclude Lewis Hamilton from that conversation. Even before he got into a go-kart, Lewis Hamilton was an incredibly talented and unusually serious child RC racer. By the time he was 13, he was already noticed and signed by McLaren. At 22, he debuted in Formula One with the best rookie season of all time, coming within a single point of winning the championship. Hamilton's story was a heart-warmer, and it was easy to agree that he deserved a championship. I would say most people wanted to see him win at least one, and the very next year, the fans got what they wanted. He won the Drivers' Championship. But then Lewis didn't win another title from 2009 all the way to 2013. And back then, it was still very easy to be pulling for him because he was so talented, but McLaren just wasn't giving him what he needed to win another title. Many people were shocked by his move to Mercedes for 2013, and even felt like he betrayed McLaren, who helped him through his junior career and gave him a world-class car in his rookie season. But the joke was on them, because McLaren hasn't won a single title since then, and Lewis has won 6 more drivers and 7 more constructors championships with Mercedes. It was during this time that I found it harder and harder not just to cheer for him, but to even like him. Cheering for an underdog is easy, And so is cheering for the promising new guy. But for many people, myself included, it is very difficult to cheer for the obvious favorite to win. The Mercedes power unit was virtually unbeatable at the start of the turbo hybrid era, but Rosberg was giving Hammy a run for his money. So while he wasn't getting any external competition, he was having to fight tooth and nail against his teammate. In fact, one might even argue that he fought dirty. But that's why he's the winningest driver of all time. He does what it takes to win. For those of us outside England, it got even harder to stay in Hamilton's corner after Rosberg finally won a championship and decided to leave Formula One to become the Monaco-based YouTuber he is now. Lewis was left without competition and became the obvious favorite to win for years on end. Bottas was hired on a series of one-year contracts to support Hamilton, but if we're being honest, Valtteri was never able to truly take the fight to Lewis. So he fell in line, and together the two of them became the winningest driver pairing of all time.
I need that extra point, guys. Copy, we're on it. Valtteri, it's James. Please abort the fastest lap attempt before the end of the lap.
I know I'm not alone in feeling this way, but I was fully sick of Mercedes and Hamilton by the time 2021 rolled around and Max finally had a car that could challenge for the title. 2021 was an incredibly exciting season to watch. Young upstart versus entrenched veteran. The man who held all the records versus the man who would eventually break them. There are so many ways to describe the title fight between Max and Lewis, but it's important to remember that at the time, there was a ton of public appetite for someone to win who wasn't Lewis. I didn't even particularly like Max at the time, but like a lot of people, I wanted anyone but Lewis to win. And during my Christmas party the night before Abu Dhabi 2021, I remember blasting Supermax at 2 a.m. and being totally pumped to watch the race the next morning. I'm not going to get into what happened in Abu Dhabi 2021. This video isn't about that. But I do think it's safe to say that no one was truly satisfied with the outcome of that race. I certainly wasn't. I wanted Max to win, but not like this. Hamilton didn't win another race for a long time after this. 2022 was especially demoralizing for Hamilton, as Mercedes went from the favorite to win to kind of a joke. But it wasn't just Lewis's ego that took a bruising. His car was literally hurting him physically. The porpoising in this season was no joke, but the way that Mercedes handled it kind of was. 2022 was the first time in Hamilton's entire career that he went a whole season without at least one race win. Even worse, his teammate, George Russell, managed to score a victory in the same car. So it can't even be said that his car was incapable of winning a race. Because it did. This was when I started to feel bad for Lewis. It wasn't like he was any less talented, but his spirit felt broken. 2023 was almost as bad. Mercedes was still floundering and ended up abandoning their zero pod concept, and Lewis went winless once again. But at least this time, so did his teammate, so you really can blame it on the car. And you know Lewis hadn't lost his talent because he still managed to give Checo a run for second place, despite the RB19 being the most dominant Formula One car of all time. It was heartbreaking to watch the former champion struggle with the team that he once unironically told the press doesn't make mistakes.
They kind of make a mistake building that car.
My team don't make mistakes.
At this point in time, I had a ton of sympathy for the 7-time world champion, but I don't like whining. Getting down on yourself is not a good look. And while I might have felt bad for him, I certainly wasn't cheering for him. I was too stoked on Alonso's successes that came after his move to Aston Martin. You see, I was really bummed about Seb leaving the grid in a slump. But Fernando's resurgence had me fully on board the Alonso hype train. I wasn't even thinking about Hamilton. But then, right before the 2024 season started, F1 needed to bury the news about how they were rejecting Andretti. So it leaked that Hamilton had signed a historic deal to go to Ferrari. Honestly, given how badly Mercedes fumbled the first 2 years of the new ground effects era, I wasn't surprised that Lewis wanted to jump ship, and Ferrari had shown some flashes of brilliance over the past couple years. So this didn't bother me at all. In fact, I was hoping it would bring the light back into his eyes and give me a reason to cheer for him again. But as it turns out, I wouldn't have to wait for Hammy to don the red race suit for him to come alive again. Seemingly out of nowhere, nearly halfway through 2024, Mercedes got their shit together, and Hamilton finally won his first race since Abu Dhabi 2021. at Silverstone, his home race. He burst into tears, and so did I. Not only did he win, but he took the victory on merit. This wasn't a fluke, right place at the right time situation like Ocon in Hungary. Hamilton genuinely earned and deserved this win. The car was good enough, he was on his game, and luckily, he didn't suffer the same mechanical failure his teammate did. The light came back into his eyes, the flame was reignited, and I was so happy for him. Just a few races later, at Spa, the Merc was once again on top. Russell and Hamilton took an easy 1-2, but then, after the race, George's car got weighed and subsequently body shamed for being 1.5 kilograms underweight. This gives Hamilton his second win in just 3 races. And while this one may not have been entirely on merit, he was looking like a favorite to win for quite some time there, so he can still be proud of this success. If you've noticed at this point, I've shared who I've been cheering for over the past few years: Vettel, Alonso, and now I'm building a case for Hamilton. Have you caught the common thread? If you haven't, I can explain it by telling you about my own background. I am a 35-year-old former athlete. I love seeing an old guy experience resurgent success later in his career. I especially love seeing a former world champion who hasn't won a ship in years get put into a race-winning car. And just once, I want to see an old guy add one more championship to his count. I want to see someone who everyone called washed come back and show the world he's still got it. I wish Schumi had been able to win with Mercedes. And I wish Vettel had been able to win with Aston Martin. And I want the same for Alonso. But so far, they've all come up short. But I don't feel the same way about Lewis. As soon as the Mercedes was capable of winning races on merit, he did it. If Ferrari gives him a good car, and I think there's a reasonable chance they do, I think Lewis is going to be the first old guy to win another championship after a drought. And as someone whose glory days in his chosen sport are firmly behind him, I want to see someone older than me do it and prove it can be done. His confidence is back, his mentality is improving, the talent never went away, and the competitive flame is burning brightly. I am ready to cheer for Lewis again. I want to see a 40-year-old stamp his name on the World Championship for the first time in nearly 60 years. I'm ready to be happy for Hamilton when he gets his 8th title, in a way that I wasn't in 2021. I would not have felt anything for him if he had done it back then. But now that he's gone through the trials of the last 3 years, I think he deserves to have that shot one more time to show everyone that he can do it. And frankly, I think he can. P.S. Everything that I said about Hamilton goes doubly for Alonso, and I know that if he got a championship-capable car, he could do it, but for whatever reason, nobody wants to give him one.
Lando Norris puts himself on pole. Maybe this is the weekend that he will get it right. Lando Norris with a 4th career pole. It's lights out and away we go. Pretty even start, but Max Verstappen in the second phase is already ahead of Lando Norris into turn 1. Verstappen leads from Norris on the inside. Max Verstappen who got the better getaway.
He did. Both McLarens had too much wheel spin as they dropped the clutch.
Yeah, my tires are just numb. They don't grip.
Norris, who started on pole and was beaten into the first corner by the home hero, but now with 20 kilometers an hour of extra pace is challenging down the main straight here. And look at that extra pace with DRS for Lando Norris, who takes the lead of the Dutch Grand Prix. Lando Norris wins in Zandvoort. Max Verstappen will come home in second place, but that Red Bull has been a distant second here this afternoon. Norris wins, Verstappen takes second.
And Norris did the fastest lap of the race on the final tour for another World Championship point. What a final lap that was. The speed, it shows you how much pace he'd still got available had he have needed it.
Didn't expect things to go as well as it did, but after getting done into turn 1 and off the line, I was actually just surprisingly calm, maybe because I'm a bit used to going backwards at the start.
What can you and the team do to improve the situation going forward?
Not get wheel spin.
When the news broke that Logan Sargent was losing his seat, not only did America lose its only representation on the grid, but it happened in the most embarrassing way possible, mid-season and to a junior driver. This means that Williams management felt that literally anyone else would be a better gamble than to continue with Sargent. And at the very least, they could get some value out of the car by using it to give some real-world experience to one of their academy drivers. Luckily for me, I'm not American, so none of this affects me. At least my country still has a driver on the grid. But in fairness, my country is only represented by a terrible pay driver. And while it is true that Logan's father, Harry Sargent III, is a billionaire who made all of his money selling oil to the American military during the war in the Middle East, and could absolutely afford to buy Williams for his son the same way Lawrence Stroll bought a team to give his son a seat, Harry Sargent III didn't have to. Williams has maintained that Logan is not a pay driver. Following the advent of the cost cap, Williams no longer needed Latifi's dirty Canadian money, so they pulled their most promising academy driver, Logan Sargent, up from F2, where he finished the 2022 season in 4th place. Yes, he was young and inexperienced, but all he had to do was be better than the worst driver in Formula 1. Not a tall ask. Or was it? In the only Formula 1 season he completed, he finished 21st in a 20-driver season. But he was also in the worst car, and his rookie season, not to mention his teammate got all the upgrades first. So looking back over the course of his season and a half in Formula 1, was he really as bad as people make him out to be? Well... Yes. Yes, he was. As Charles Leclerc and Ferrari triumphed over the dominant McLarens in Monza today, the only thing louder than the cheering of the Tifosi was the incompetence of McLaren. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like the obstacles to Lando getting a championship. First lap Lando once again lost a race in the first lap, this time thanks to a bold overtake from his teammate Oscar Piastri. It didn't matter though, because apparently we live in Bizarro World, where Ferrari's strategists can pull off a victory even when they don't have the fastest car. Leclerc is once again riding high. After having previously won his own home race in Monaco, he's now won his team's home race in Italy. This time thanks to pulling off a difficult one-stop strategy that kept him ahead of the dominant McLarens. When asked how it felt, Leclerc lit a cigarette, rolled over, and fell asleep. After the race, Zach Brown said, "We have two number one drivers," which was his way of saying, Lando may be in the lead right now, but we know Oscar's going to be better than him in the future, so we're not going to do anything to piss him off, even if it costs Lando the championship. Or, in other words, they've adopted the 2018 Red Bull strategy of favoring the young star they see as the team's future, even if it costs them the old guy that used to be their golden boy. McLaren made it clear today that they're willing to give up a 2024 Lando Norris WDC for a 2025 Piastri championship. And while there was nothing unfair about Oscar's overtake, if McLaren was at all serious about helping Lando get a driver's championship this year, they would have made sure that everyone, including their other driver, was doing everything possible to help him catch Max, which, given the pace of their car, would be possible if the team was willing to make that happen. But obviously, they're fine with just a Constructors' Championship, which is all but guaranteed at this point. They're getting complacent, and it shows. Now, we could get into all of the reasons why McLaren isn't insisting that Piastri play the role of Barrichello for the rest of this season, but I think it's pretty clear. The team knows that they have the Constructors' Championship in the bag and doesn't want to risk losing the ever-increasing talent that is the young Australian, because they know their MVP isn't going anywhere. And no, I'm not referring to Lando Norris. I'm talking about the number one contributor to McLaren's inevitable Constructors' Championship, Sergio Perez. Checo keeping his seat has basically guaranteed McLaren's victory in the WCC. And while he finished only 2 spots behind Max in this race, you don't get praise for doing what's expected of you, especially when you regularly fail to meet expectations. Checo also called the car a boat, given its propensity for understeer, while Max referred to it as the reason why he was willing to bury the hatchet with Toto. Key players at Red Bull have insisted that the RB20 is not actually bad. It's still faster than the RB19, but rather their performance deficit is due to other teams improving their cars. Most pundits seem to be attributing this to the loss of Adrian Newey and Rob Marshall, but it feels like everyone is forgetting about the wind tunnel time penalty that Red Bull took. And this roadmap released by Christian Horner all but confirms it. Sure, Max Verstappen was only able to take 6th place in Monza, but Red Bull is far from the biggest drop in form on the grid. Aston Martin went from being the second fastest car on the regular to consistently finishing outside the points. And on that note, before we go to the pull of the week, the Canadian Positivity Guy is here to offer his opinion on the subject. Alex Albon started the race in 9th and finished 9th. Fernando Alonso started in 11th and finished 11th. These are solid examples of great drivers getting the most out of their mediocre cars. So can someone please explain to me how 7-year Formula 1 veteran Lance Stroll started in 17th and finished in 18th, whilst newbie driver who has literally never been in a Formula 1 race, Franco Colapinto, started behind Stroll and finished 6 places ahead of him. Honestly, it feels a lot like when I broke up with your mom after 7 years, only to find out that literally anyone was a better lay. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. This week, for the poll of the week, I asked, who's going to win the WDC in 2024? And more than 80% of respondents said Max Verstappen, while the remaining few votes went to Lando Norris. Which is hilarious given how McLaren's car is so much better than Red Bull right now, and demonstrates just how unwilling McLaren is when it comes to throwing their weight behind Lando Norris. Will Buxton made a very impassioned rant about it that's been making its way around the internet. And if you're British, you probably agreed with him. But for those of us outside the UK, we see it a little differently. Buxton had to imply that Piastri must have a number 1 driver clause in his contract, and that Lando's mistakes came down to driving angry. But if that was Sainz who got passed by Chuck on the first lap and then made a bunch of errors, they'd say, well, you have to be level-headed if you want to win the WDC. The moral of the story here is find someone who looks after you the way the British media looks after any British driver. And now, it's back. That little thing I hide at the end of the video. The spicy joke of the week. Lando Norris was asked how he feels after the race, to which he responded, you know when you put in a ton of effort on the toilet only to squeeze out a tiny little nugget, and you're left wondering how you put in so much work for so little in return? Which is ironic. Given how hard his team fucked him, you'd think the turds would just fall right out of him. Following Oscar Piastri's win in Baku, McLaren took the lead in the Constructors' Championship, thanks in large part to the contributions of one driver, Sergio Perez. In fact, we have Checo to thank for making this season as exciting as it is, because if there was a better driver in that seat, there's a good chance 2024 would not have felt as competitive. And for that reason, we should all be grateful. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like Checo's career somehow. Sergio Perez was killing it in Baku and was ready to put the naysayers to rest, as he outqualified his goated teammate and was poised to take a podium right up until he decided to do his best George Russell impression and crashed with just 1 lap to go, taking a race that was already exciting and catapulting it into contention for the title of best race of the season. The incident between Checo and Carlos was deemed by the stewards to not be anyone's fault, but I see it a little differently. Checo was squeezing Carlos and had plenty of track to work with, whilst Sainz, who was ahead, had no room to maneuver and clearly could not see the Mexican between his axles as he started to slowly drift onto the racing line. As far as the stewards are concerned, this isn't enough to lay the blame solely at the feet of one driver. But as far as Checo is concerned, there is one confounding factor that I think needs to be taken into account. Checo should have been doing everything possible to make sure he made it to the finish. And when your team is poised to lose its lead in the Constructors' Championship, and the dominant narrative in the media is about you losing your seat, you should be willing to scooch over a little bit when there's a driver slowly moving into your space who clearly can't see you. And it gets worse. Not only was Perez poised to overtake Carlos within a few corners, but it was looking like he could potentially even get ahead of Charles before the finish line, thanks to both Ferraris being completely out of rear grip. And this speaks to my main criticism of Checo. He takes needless risks that almost never pay off. The more desperate he gets, the more risks he takes, and the more they fail to pay off. He's like a gambler who keeps borrowing money to pay off his gambling debts, and as he needs increasingly bigger wins to pay off his debts, he makes riskier bets, which makes them even more unlikely to pay off.
and the situation just spirals out of control. It was Ayrton Senna who said, if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver. So what does that make a man who continually goes for gaps that don't exist? In Checo's case, it seems like the main gap he's going for is the one between him and his teammate. Max Verstappen hasn't seen the top step of the podium since Spain. It's actually only been on the podium twice since then. And yet he still has more than double the number of points that Perez has. And while I don't think anyone at Red Bull expects Sergio to be beating Max on the regular, or even at all, they definitely expect him to be getting the most out of the car. And his lack of contribution is what makes him McLaren's MVP in the battle for this year's Constructors' Championship. If Perez had scooched over instead of watching Sainz slowly move into him, let's assume a worst-case scenario where he finishes 4th. He would have taken home 13 points, and Max would have finished 7th, for a total of 19 points between them. Lando would have stayed in 6th, and while McLaren still would have overtaken Red Bull, it would have been 471 to 465, a mere 6-point spread, instead of the 20-point gap there is now. That is a significant difference that will be very difficult to overcome before the end of the season. But this problem didn't start in Azerbaijan. It goes all the way back to Australia. When Max had his first DNF in nearly 3 years, Checo only managed a paltry 5th place, finishing a full 56 seconds behind a Carlos Sainz that could barely even walk. In Imola, he took 8th place while Max won, and he didn't score points again until Spain, where he got 4 points to Max's 25. When Red Bull had a car that was good enough to win, they needed both drivers to be filling their boots because there is no guarantee that a car will remain dominant in the modern era, especially when there are wind tunnel restrictions based on where you finished last season, as well as how much catering your company ordered. And now that McLaren has a car that's better than Red Bull, it's too late for the drivers to make up the difference. They could have 2 Max Verstappens in their cars right now, and McLaren would still be catching up to them. That's why they needed to pull as big a gap as possible while things were going well. If Checo had been even Bottas tier and was scoring 60% as many points as his teammate in the best car, he'd be 5th place instead of 8th and would have 45 more points than he has now. Red Bull would still be in the lead, McLaren would still be catching up, but at least you wouldn't be able to lay the blame squarely at one person's feet for the battle being one-sided, as everyone would be pulling their weight. Let's come back to the present though, and assume the best case scenario. Checo passes both Ferraris to take 2nd place and nobody crashes out. In that scenario, Red Bull takes home 14 more points than they did, McLaren gets 5 fewer, and Ferrari gets 10 more. The top 3 places in the Constructors' Championship would look like this, which would actually put the Red Clowns within striking distance of 1st place in quite possibly the most exciting upset of all year, all thanks to Mexico's finest racing driver. Amusingly, Checo's foibles have benefited more than just McLaren. Thanks to his crash with Carlos in Baku, Franco Colapinto and Oliver Behrman finished in 8th and 10th respectively. And here to talk about F1's newest rookies is the Canadian positivity guy. Literal fetus Ollie Behrman scored a point in Azerbaijan, making him the first driver in history to score points for 2 separate teams in his first 2 races. But that isn't even the most impressive thing a rookie did in Baku this weekend. Franco Colapinto scored 4 points in his 2nd F1 race, giving him quadruple the number of points that Logan Sargent scored in his entire career. And it gets better. Not only did he outscore his predecessor's entire career, he also outscored a 7-year Formula 1 veteran who is in an objectively better car. In the last 5 races, Colapinto has scored 4 times as many points as Aston Martin's Lance Stroll, which is funny because Colapinto hasn't even participated in 3 of the last 5 races, and Stroll has only scored 1 point since Hungary, compared to his teammates' 13. Does this mean that Colapinto is a great driver? Maybe. Does this mean that Logan Sargent actually was trash? Also maybe. But there's one important lesson that I think Aston Martin can take from the situation at Williams. You'd probably be better off gambling on a junior driver who has literally never been in a Formula 1 race. This message brought to you by Felipe Drugovich. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Look, I know I've given Checo a lot of credit for making 2024 interesting, but all jokes aside, there are a few other people who deserve acknowledgement for turning this season around. First off, Christian Horner and Jos Verstappen deserve praise for taking one of the most dominant Formula 1 teams of all time and turning it into a shit show with their petty power struggle. Thanks to the personality deficits of these 2 men, Red Bull is no longer dominating, We have legitimate competition for both titles, and Adrian Newey jumped ship to Aston Martin, potentially giving us something F1 fans have wanted for a long time, another Alonso championship. I would say we should also be grateful to Red Bull for choosing to copy Mercedes' homework when it comes to the zero pod concept. I love that they chose to learn the hard way that it's an inconsistent design that no mortal human can understand, especially since they lost their god of car design, that is Adrian Newey. I also think Oscar Piastri doesn't get enough credit for making 2024 the gong show that it is today. By inconsistently outperforming Lando Norris, he's put McLaren in the awkward situation of not having a clear lead driver, and the team obviously doesn't have the stones to ask him to support Lando in a title fight. So big thanks go to the Australian for making McLaren's situation messy. And then of course there's Yuki Tsunoda, the driver who, no matter how well he does, will never get a Red Bull seat for whatever reason. Regardless, if he had gotten thoroughly thrashed by Ricciardo, there's a good chance that Danny would have taken Checo's seat. And then we would have known for sure if Danny was washed. But thanks to Tsunoda's consistent performances, we Honey Badger fans will get to assert for the rest of time that he never was actually bad. He just didn't gel with the McLaren, and if he got put back into a Red Bull, he would have been just as good as he used to be. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking that I hate Checo, but I actually don't. Do I think Red Bull should replace him? Yes. Am I glad they didn't? Also yes. As much as I would have loved to see Red Bull put Danny Ric in that seat, I'm grateful they didn't, because it has given us a proper title fight as they fight one-handed against the likes of McLaren and Ferrari. But I also made a pretty good case recently for why Red Bull should put Danny Ric in that seat effective immediately.
Lando Norris has laid down a statement win here in Singapore tonight.
I wanted to be happy for Lando Norris as he crossed the finish line in Singapore and finally survived lap 1 after a pole position start. And for a brief time, I was. But that quickly came to an end as Daniel Ricciardo gave a very emotional interview in the post-race show. And if you feel like you need emotional support after that, you're not alone. I know I sure do. Welcome to the support group meeting for Daniel Ricciardo fans. Let's help each other get through these trying times. Let's rewind a little bit. Daniel Ricciardo's soft and cuddly appearance, coupled with his ferocious and fearless driving style, earned him the nickname the Honey Badger. But where did this come from? As you may recall, Honey Badger Don't Care was a very popular meme back in the day, when some guy named Randall did his own narration over National Geographic footage showing just how fearless honey badgers are.
This is the honey badger. Watch it run in slow motion.
This video with over 100 million views debuted back in 2011, just like our beloved Danny Ric. And while the honey badger meme did fade into obscurity relatively quickly, Danny Ric didn't, and if anything, he's probably the last person carrying a torch for the honey badger meme.
Watch this, look, a snake's up in the tree. Honey badger don't care.
Rumors were circulating before the Grand Prix that Daniel Ricciardo could lose his seat after Singapore. And now, just 13 years after he walked into our lives, it looks like he's going to be walked off the grid mid-season.
Honey badger don't give a shit, it just takes what it wants.
He sat in his car for an extra long time after the race, trying to savor the moment. He explained to the media that he has to be prepared for this to be it. But the real question is, are we prepared for this to be it? Red Bull has always followed the Sith rule of two: a master who holds the power, and an apprentice who covets it and trains to one day usurp their master. Danny has been playing the Red Bull game long enough to have seen himself on both sides of this power dynamic, multiple times. By his second season at Toro Rosso, he beat his teammate Jean-Eric Vergne and found himself in the seat of an actual Red Bull by 2014, where he wasted no time thrashing Vettel and was even touted by many to be the best driver on the grid that year. But unfortunately, he didn't have the best car, or more accurately, he didn't have the best engine, so he had to settle for third place behind the dominant Mercedes. So how did Danny go from being the best driver on the grid to losing his seat twice in 2 years? It's an unfortunately common tale in F1. His talent peaked at a time when he didn't have access to a championship-capable car. By 2018, Max was starting to consistently beat Danny, and the team was lining up behind Verstappen. At the same time, Red Bull very publicly dropped Renault as their engine supplier, and was moving to Honda for their power units. The same Honda that built that GP2 engine that broke Alonso and triggered his first retirement from F1. To further complicate matters, Red Bull was allowing Max to get away with murder, and Cyril Abiteboul was driving up to Danny's house with dump trucks full of money, begging him to join Renault. So he did. At the time, this seemed like a relatively safe decision, as the Honda unit was not just an unknown, they had a bad reputation, and Renault was a full works team that Red Bull had won 4 championships with. Who could have known that Honda would somehow do a full 180 and build a beast of an engine, while Renault would continue to be super mid? It seems like everyone who goes to Renault sees very quickly that they don't have what it takes to win and jumps ship. Danny had a 2-year contract with them and did take the team to new heights, getting them back on the podium, but he signed with McLaren just 1 year into his deal with Renault. And at the time, this seemed like a good move. In fact, you could even say that it was the right move, because if Danny had been able to drive that McLaren competently, he would be in a championship capable car right now, and might even be giving Max a run for his money. But we all know that didn't happen. Instead, this is where it all falls apart. He managed to win a race with McLaren, which gave us hope, but the honest truth is that his driving style was fundamentally incompatible with the cars McLaren gave him. Is that McLaren's fault? No. The sign of a truly great driver is their ability to adapt their driving style. A difference in car, conditions, etc. means a different racing line is necessary to go as fast as possible. Danny may like a twitchy rear end that allows him to brake really late, but that's not what the McLaren needed to be fast. And obviously it wasn't impossible to extract pace from the car, as that's what the young Lando Norris was able to do, as was Carlos Sainz before him. What followed was what I consider to truly be the end of Danny's career. What he tried to do was stick it out with McLaren, break down his driving style, and learn what he needed to do to go fast in Papaya. But what he actually did was break down his spirit and lose what made him special. His bravado. That honey badger don't care combination of ferocity and fearlessness. The ability to intuitively pass and be the last of the late breakers. He tried to go cerebral when what he needed most was in his heart. Athletes cannot be actively thinking about what they need to do before they do it, especially when they're going over 300 kilometers per hour. That's what training and practice are for. Learning what you need to do and when to do it. So in the moment, you don't waste time thinking about your actions. You just instinctively know what to do. I'm not saying athletes don't think. What I'm saying is the speed at which they have to make decisions is so fast that they can't waste time second guessing themselves. They need to be able to trust their instincts. The same instincts they have spent their entire lives honing. The cold hard truth is, Danny is not an adaptable driver. He has a driving style that suits him, and when he has a car that suits that driving style, he is a force to be reckoned with. Or at least, he was. In early 2022, when Sainz was spinning out and Leclerc was performing, that's how we knew that Charles was a cut above Carlos. When Max was setting world records whilst Checo, a very competent and experienced driver, was struggling to keep the car on the road, that's how we knew Verstappen was on a whole other level from Perez. And when Lando Norris was continuing to extract pace from a car that the veteran Daniel Ricciardo couldn't figure out, that's how we knew that Norris was on a different level. So when Danny got dropped by McLaren and Christian Horner rescued him, like a man finding out that his ex-girlfriend had surrendered their old dog to a shelter, it really did feel like he was getting a second chance. But the reality is, he was never going to get that chance. In fact, I would argue that Red Bull taking him back only to let him languish at the junior team is a lot less like rescuing your old dog from a shelter, and a lot more like an ex taking you back only to end things a year later when they realize they still don't want to be with you for all the same reasons as before. The only difference is that this time, they got to dump you instead of you leaving them. Red Bull clearly had no intention of promoting anyone to the second Red Bull seat, as there were many times in 2023 and 2024 when the obvious correct decision was to replace Checo. At best, keeping Ricciardo in the wings was a way to keep Perez compliant, but all they've managed to do is break the spirits of 2 drivers. Sergio Perez went into Red Bull as one of the 5 drivers in history to pull off a last to first victory. He's obviously not trash, but he's also not compatible with the car they've given him, and that is painfully obvious. Given that they brought back Ricciardo specifically after he did a tire test and matched Verstappen's pole lap at the same track in the same car, you'd think they would have wanted to put him in it just to see if he could do better. He certainly couldn't do worse. That's why I think there's something else at play here. If I had to guess, they're either worried that he would take too big a bite out of Verstappen's success, or he was only ever there for them to use as a threat if Perez ever stepped out of line. And I'm more inclined to believe it's the latter. I can see someone like Jos Verstappen insisting they make sure the second driver is playing the role of Barrichello, and is explicitly there to support the lead driver by towing him in quali, running interference in races, and grabbing the fastest lap point when Max doesn't have the luxury to do it himself. If Ricciardo had truly been brought back to see if he could cut it in the top team, bringing him back to the junior team expecting him to trounce their entrenched driver of 3 years was an odd move, especially if the car doesn't handle like the Red Bull does. They picked up the Honey Badger knowing he was only truly good in a car that handled like a Red Bull, then told him he could only get in the Red Bull if he could prove he could be good in a car that wasn't one. I'm not even saying this was unfair to Daniel. I'm saying this was a waste of a seat. They knew he couldn't be exceptional in that car, so why did they even bother? They would have probably been better off just keeping him as a reserve driver at Red Bull and then giving the junior seat to Liam Lawson. That way, they could benefit from the good PR of having Danny on the team, and his mere presence would be the threat they need to Checo. Meanwhile, they'd still be building experience within their junior ranks to make sure they have great drivers lined up for the future. This is one of the many problems with Red Bull owning 2 teams. They can just sit on drivers and let them languish, because they don't have to truly commit to them. Other teams can't make these half commitments. They have to either offer the driver a proper seat or no seat at all. Honestly though, what I truly can't figure out is why they don't just toss Danny into that second Red Bull seat to see what happens. Like literally just pull Perez for a race or 2 and see how it goes, even if it's not a permanent arrangement. But since it's clear that Checo's performance was never the deciding factor in his retaining the seat, it begs the question, why did they keep Ricciardo this long? I have a pretty good idea as to why they kept him on until Singapore. It is a brutal race that requires exceptional fitness to endure, and this ain't Danny's first rodeo, but unfortunately, it might be his last. And Will Buxton described it best.
I don't like that at all. A broken Daniel Ricciardo is that's a really difficult thing to watch.
I'm with you, Will.
It's a terrible day for rain.
What do you mean? It's not raining.
Yes, it is.
Oh, so it is.
At the start of this season, if you were asked who would win the Constructors' Championship, you would have had to be crazy to say anyone other than Red Bull. And now, they're barely even in the fight for second place. Let's talk about that. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends. Just like this season. 2024 has been the longest Formula One season ever. And while it has been exhausting, it has shown one of the benefits of a long, drawn-out season. It gives other teams a chance to catch up to the frontrunners. Just 5 races into this season, I made a video about how Formula One was so repetitive that YouTube demonetized my channel for repetitive content. True story, this actually happened. I planned to release it after the next dominant Verstappen victory, but that never came. Sure, Max did win some since then, but they were hard-fought battles that he won by the skin of his teeth. Hardly dominant. As McLaren continued to improve and the boys in Papaya became regulars on the podium, I realized this season was anything but repetitive. Max had a big lead but was slowly losing it, and a season that started off looking like it was going to be more of the same quickly became the most exciting season since the regulations changed. But there was something else I failed to notice. While we were all caught up in the battle between Red Bull and McLaren, Ferrari had been quietly performing with incredible consistency. They have been on the podium in 14 of the 20 races we've had so far this season. And now that they've taken another step forward in terms of performance, they've not only put themselves in contention for first place in the Constructors' Championship, they've basically removed Red Bull from the conversation when it comes to second place. I made a very controversial video earlier in the season when I said I'm grateful for Checo's underperformance. And this is precisely why. Perez is a solid 8th place with 150 points to Max's 362. If we take Bottas as the benchmark for a solid second driver, averaging 60% of his goated teammates' points, then Perez should be at 217, and those 67 points would make all the difference. I don't lay the blame solely at Perez's feet. A 13-point lead in the Constructors with 4 races to go is by no means a foregone conclusion, but it would have kept them in the fight. It's clear their car is no longer the fastest on the grid, especially after all of those rules clarifications seem to have nerfed them. But as it currently stands, they need to find some performance out of nowhere if they want to claw their way back into the lead, or even second. Ferrari coming from behind to take the fight to McLaren this late in the season has to be one of the most exciting upsets since 2007, when Ferrari came from behind to take the fight to McLaren late in the season. But this time, instead of Ferrari scooping up points while the McLaren drivers fight each other, they're scooping up points while Max forces Lando off the road. Now, call me crazy, but in the last few races, I have seen a lot of parallels between Max's recent actions and the way Michael Schumacher was acting near the end of his 1997 campaign. You know, the one where he tried to win by crashing his rival out? Is nobody in Max's camp willing to tell him how that turned out for Schumi? I know the stewards finally got on top of this in Mexico, but they should have shut this down a lot earlier. Lando made it quite clear in the press conference after Mexico that he's just trying not to crash right now, because Max would obviously benefit from that, given his massive lead. There is no question that Max has been driving dangerously recently, and it stinks of desperation. But every time he slams the door on Lando, he opens the door for Ferrari to just waltz right through. And that's what they've been doing. Look at turn 1 in Austin. That dive bomb handed the race to Charles. It was the same in Mexico when Max ran Lando off the road, opening the door for a Ferrari to just slip right through. Following Mexico, Ferrari is now 29 points behind McLaren and 25 ahead of Red Bull. Another 1-2 victory for them wouldn't be enough to overtake McLaren unless the Papaya Boys had an unusually bad race, but they're coming off a 1-2 followed by a 1-3. So it seems very possible that they could put up a few more very good results before the end of the season and clinch the championship. But even if Ferrari wins in 2024, that only makes Red Bull stronger in the long run. If Red Bull finishes in third this season, which I expect they will, then their aerodynamic testing time jumps from 70% to 80%, which could be crucial in a year when they're preparing for new aerodynamic regulations. This could make all the difference in 2026, assuming Red Bull hasn't been crippled by the loss of all the key figures who've left their team this year. But Red Bull isn't the only team losing a major contributor. Ferrari is dropping Carlos Sainz at the top of his game in exchange for 40-year-old Lewis Hamilton. Now, I'm not saying Lewis is washed, but we don't know how he's going to fare at Ferrari after a 10-year stint with a team that was built around him. Not to mention, he's spent his entire career driving with Mercedes engines. There's a lot that's going to be up in the air after this season, and that's great. But I still have one major concern. I don't know about you, but I've been finding myself burning out of Formula One a little bit recently. I still enjoy it, but there are just too many races. I should be more excited than ever about the title fight, but instead, I find myself wishing it would just conclude. Austin showed us why we don't need Miami or Las Vegas. Circuit of the Americas is a world-class track that provides phenomenal racing. These cars were meant for purpose-built race tracks, and street circuits just feel like filler at this point. And filler is the one thing we don't need anymore. I would love to see F1 cut the calendar down and just focus on better racing. If you're going to add something to the calendar, it needs to bring a unique aspect to the racing, like the thin air in Mexico or the curbs in Montreal. Instead of dumping $10 billion into purchasing property in Las Vegas just so you can get some picturesque photos of F1 cars racing down the Las Vegas Strip, they could have spent far less money and purchased property just outside of Las Vegas and built a world-class facility. There's plenty of space. The only reason I can think of as to why they didn't do that is because of corporate execs who get off on the idea of picturesque photos of F1 cars driving down the Las Vegas Strip. But frankly, I couldn't care less about cool photos. What I want is more of what we got in Texas and Mexico, and less of what we got in Miami and Monaco. I should be excited by the end of the season, especially when both championships are in contention and there's the possibility for the third place team to come from behind and upset for the victory. They need to leave us wanting more. But instead, I feel like I've got my fill, and I just want some time to digest. The 2024 season's hottest race is the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. It has everything. Changing weather conditions, rookies who have never driven an F1 car in the wet, backmarkers on the podium, and oh look, is that a fat kid on a slip and slide? No, it's a generational drive from a generational talent. Okay, terrible Stefan impression aside, there is so much to talk about with this race. And if there's one thing I love, it's talking about Formula One. So I hope you'll pop into the comments and mention anything that comes to mind throughout the course of this video. I will give you my personal guarantee that I will respond to every comment.
It's been a long time coming, mate, but boy, was that worth the wait. You are the man.
Oh, yes!
When was the last time you heard Max Verstappen get that excited over a race win? Given how flat Max's reactions to winning have been over the past few years, this was the moment that truly solidified the 2024 Sao Paulo Grand Prix as the greatest race of this season. Or maybe even this whole entire era. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like great racing in Brazil. Let's set the stage. The start of the 2024 Formula One season was disappointing for everyone who wasn't a Verstappen fan. Max dominated every race he finished, right up until China. And then his fortunes started to change. McLaren started catching up, and Red Bull was falling apart behind the scenes. And suddenly, what we all thought was going to be another season of Red Bull dominance turned into something much more competitive. There were some major milestones achieved for drivers who had earned a reputation for being unlucky. Charles Leclerc finally won his home race in Monaco, and Lando No Wins finally won his first race in Miami and started down the path of maybe chasing Max for the title. Max may have had a huge lead over Lando, but the McLaren was now the car to beat, and both Norris and Piastri were making the most of it. And Red Bull, if I'm being honest, was fighting one-handed. So it wasn't going to be that hard for McLaren to catch Red Bull, but it's going to be a lot harder for Norris to catch Verstappen. This season has really driven home the point that having the best car is only one piece to winning a championship. To win the Constructors' Championship, you need to have two drivers who can consistently maximize the package they have available to them. But to win the Drivers' Championship, you need a guy who can get more out of his car than anyone else. And what made this season, and this race in particular, quite interesting is that McLaren had the former, while Red Bull had the latter. And this was no accident. Red Bull likes to follow the old Ferrari ethos of hiring the greatest driver in the world and supporting him in every way possible. And this includes putting a compliant but super mid driver into that second seat with the understanding that he may have to sacrifice his own race to support the lead driver. But this would be to Red Bull's detriment, because Checo wasn't able to fill his boots with points while they had the best car on the grid. And ever since then, he always finds himself too far down the grid on race day to be of any help to Max. McLaren, on the other hand, was still operating like a midfield team who gets two of the best drivers they can find and favors no one. And this would be to their detriment, as they would refuse to do anything that would compromise Oscar until it was already too late. Oscar handed Lando the lead of the sprint right before it ended, but in the Grand Prix, due to making the wrong call on pitting behind the safety car, McLaren wasn't able to keep Lando in the fight for the Drivers' Championship. So ultimately, Oscar's sacrifice was for nothing. Long term, this might be good for McLaren, as it looks like Piastri is going to be their best bet for a driver's title in the coming years. And with Mark Webber managing him, I'm sure he's extra sensitive when it comes to playing second fiddle. But we'll see how that plays out. For this season, throwing their full weight behind Lando was McLaren's only shot at winning both titles. And they came up short. And that's how we ended up with the powder keg that was the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. Max hadn't won a race since Spain. In fact, he hadn't even finished within 19 seconds of the race leader in the past 10 races. He was getting desperate. He had been driving dangerously for a couple races, seemingly hoping for a crash with Lando. And the stewards were doing a weird job handling it. When Max ran Lando off the road in Austin, the stewards gave Lando a penalty? So of course Max stepped up the behavior in Mexico. And then the stewards came back at him with 20 seconds worth of penalties. Honestly, it wasn't looking good for Verstappen. In fact, he was acting a lot like Michael Schumacher in 1997, and I was worried if the dangerous driving didn't get addressed, he might end up going down the same path that Schumi did when he got disqualified from the entire championship for dangerous driving when he tried to win by crashing out his title rival. I think everyone can agree we were happy to see the stewards finally grow some balls and get Max back on the straight and narrow. Now let's take a second to talk about the point situation going into the Grand Prix. Following Lando's win at the sprint, where Max only got 4th place, the gap between them had narrowed to just 44 points. With 4 races left, this was still a big gap, but not insurmountable. But it wasn't like McLaren was coming into this with a dominant car. Ferrari had been quietly performing all season and was rolling into this race hot off the heels of a 1-2 followed by a 1-3. McLaren took a 1-2 in the sprint, but Ferrari got a 3-5 with Max nestled in between them in 4th place. So the odds of McLaren winning were looking to be about the same as a sick person having a dry fart. Possible, but by no means a guarantee. And on that subject, the sprint was the last time anything would be dry or normal this weekend. The torrential downpour of rain delayed qualifying twice, and they ended up postponing it to the following morning. So quali happened at 7:30 local time, with the race to happen 5 hours later. This weekend was shaping up to be as unusual as an Alpine podium. Don't worry, we'll get to that later. The weather in Brazil was actually feeling a lot like the weather during the Canadian Grand Prix this season. Changing conditions, with cars going out for most of each round, trying to get the best lap possible in before a red flag came. Both Canada and Brazil had quali sessions that were exciting right from the start all the way to the finish. So I recommend going back and watching both, even if you're from the future and watching this long after 2024. In fact, you might as well go back and watch the Canadian Grand Prix from 2024 while you're at it, because it was almost as good as Brazil with the changing weather conditions. But even though I'm a bit biased because I'm Canadian, I will freely admit that Brazil was the better race, even if there were a lot of similarities. In both races, only 15 cars finished, so you know things got crazy. But in Canada, the podium had George, Lando, and Max on top. In Brazil, Max was still the winner, but taking 2nd and 3rd were Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly? Honestly, it felt a lot like the time in high school when we were competing with other classes to see who could bring in the most food to donate to the food bank. And our class had barely brought in anything until on the last day, Len walked in with a 40-kilo bag of rice over his shoulder, and we won the whole thing because it was based on weight. Even though Max basically clinched his 4th world championship here, Alpine was the biggest winner in this race. Alpine jumped from 6th to 9th in the constructors, and if they can hold on to it, that will mean they increased their share of the prize pool by $50 million in a single race, all because they chose not to pit under green flags or even yellow flags. They waited until there was a red flag to change their tires. It was an incredible gamble that paid off big time, and it also seems like it went a long way to mend the relationship between Gasly and Ocon. After the race, they were both talking like they had just won the world championship. It was victory speeches in the media pen and the press conference. Honestly, it was adorable watching them both reminisce about driving around in slippery winter conditions in their go-karting days and how that set them up for driving around on worn tires in these slippery conditions. All of this, of course, set the scene perfectly for the astonishing drive from Max Verstappen. Only 5 times in Formula One history has someone won a race after starting from 17th or lower on the grid. And not only did Max do that, he pulled a 19.5 second gap without even having the fastest car on the grid. That performance was pure talent, and there is no question he earned it. Due to wet conditions, there was no DRS, so every pass was pulled off the old-fashioned way, with late braking, exceptional car control, and an ass so sensitive to the car's limit that Niki Lauda would have been proud. If you look at the rest of the field, it only makes Verstappen's accomplishments look even more impressive. Checo started off 1 position behind him and finished the race in 11th, exactly in line with expectations for him. And then there's Lewis Hamilton, who is famed for his phenomenal abilities in the wet, but the resurfaced track had his Mercedes porpoising again, and he spent the whole race complaining about the car's poor handling. George Russell was doing a lot better in his Mercedes, but despite wanting to stay out, he followed his team's instructions and pitted behind the safety car, costing him vital track position right before the red flag came out. So not only did Max Verstappen outdrive everyone in the rain, but Red Bull correctly identified the strategy that would lead him to victory, and together they pulled off the most impressive race execution of this entire era. It was the drive of a champion, and this was the turning point in the championship that clinched it for Max. There is no question he is the most complete driver on the grid. And if the point of a championship is to determine who is the best, then the 2024 World Drivers' Championship crowned the correct person as the best driver in the world.
What an unbelievable race, guys. You know what that is? Simply lovely. I tell you that.
Now, a lot of you are going to say that Lando could still win it. And mathematically, that is technically correct. But he would have to outscore Max by 21 points per race for 3 races in a row, and that simply isn't going to happen. It's like in the later parts of a season in the turbo hybrid era when they would be calculating out what would need to happen for Bottas to keep the championship race alive, but we all knew it was going to Lewis. Also, I wrote this video in a way to try to make it evergreen, so years down the road, nobody's going to know that I was assuming Max won the championship before he actually did, and I'm going to delete this part of the video anyway, so consider yourself lucky that you got to see it. After the inaugural Las Vegas Grand Prix in 2023, everyone, myself included, was calling it Fire Festival 2.0, and we weren't wrong. Thanks to overpriced sandwiches, exorbitant ticket prices, a low-quality track, and unusually cold temperatures thanks to the race running in the middle of the night in November, we were right to be critical. Local businesses were empty and were even telling people to stay away unless they were attending the race. After Sainz's Ferrari was totaled by a manhole cover flying off, the practice session was ended and fans weren't even offered a refund. So the next day, F1 was slapped with a class action lawsuit over 30,000 people strong. America. Welcome to Race Weekend Update. Let's talk about how Vegas is growing on me. After 2023, the Las Vegas Grand Prix was looking like Lance Stroll's career. Underwhelming, but propped up by huge financial backing. But, unlike Lance Stroll, the event organizers learned from their mistakes and improved this year. Ticket prices were much more reasonable and most included free food, and they didn't appear to be trying to block the view of the race like they did in the first year. They did lean into the one unique aspect that this event brings to the racing. We'll get to that later. A world championship is supposed to be the ultimate test of a car and driver, putting them through as many different scenarios as possible to prove that they are unequivocally the best in the world. And it's no secret that the Formula One calendar has become bloated with street circuits and other races that bring nothing new to the table. And at first glance, Las Vegas appeared to be one of those. But thanks to the fact they race at midnight in November, Vegas brings a new test to the table in the form of single-digit weather. It was George Russell who said that racing in the cold feels like racing in the wet. And wet races are always some of the best because they level the playing field. Brazil was incredible this year for that very reason, and I even changed up my fantasy team before this race to add George to it because he is so good in low grip conditions. Frankly, even though this track looks like a dead pig, shout out David Cameron, thanks to the cold weather, it delivers when it comes to exciting racing. We saw a ton of overtakes, with second place swapping hands 10 times between 5 different drivers. But nobody was able to touch Russell, who took the most commanding victory of his entire career. And right behind him was Lewis Hamilton, who fought his way up from 10th on the grid without so much as a safety car to help him. Truly, it was a weekend of pure skill expression. And for those of us who enjoy watching professional athletes performing at their finest, it was a treat to watch. Pierre Gasly even qualified in second place, but Alpine is as Alpine does, and his engine shat the bed so publicly you'd think it was divorcing Johnny Depp. Meanwhile, his teammate Esteban Ocon missed his pit box and had to try again next lap, essentially giving himself a drive-through penalty for being an idiot. And that's not all. Ferrari closed the gap to McLaren. There's now just 24 points between them, and Charles Leclerc closed the gap to Lando Norris, putting himself just 21 points behind the guy who, until this weekend, was challenging for the title. Ironically, one of my biggest criticisms prior to the first Las Vegas Grand Prix was the timing. November weather in Vegas is typically cold, especially in the middle of the night. But now, it's the only reason I actually like the race. If they moved it to a warmer time of year, it would lose the one thing that makes it special. And speaking of special, we have a special guest we haven't seen in a while. The Canadian Positivity Guy.
Well, you've heard the British guys enough, so why don't you listen to somebody else for a change?
As a Canadian, I'm used to cold weather, but if there's one thing I enjoy more than fresh powdered snow, It's watching people from other countries deal with what I would consider to be mild temperatures. The temperatures in Las Vegas were reported to be between 10 and 17 degrees Celsius all weekend, which to me is like a warm autumn day or a cold summer day. I fully accept that 10 degrees Celsius, the coldest it got during the Grand Prix, is cold for Formula 1 cars, but not for human beings. The outfits this weekend were hilarious. It seemed like there were only two choices of outfits in the paddock this weekend. Either a parka or full sequins. Given how many people in the F1 traveling circus were in full winter attire, I was surprised to see how many of them chose instead to dress like they were auditioning for the Ziegfeld Follies. And frankly, I respect that. If ever there was a time to be flamboyant, it's when you're in Vegas. And even though Crofty was all in on the sequins, there was one outfit that left me scratching my head. Why the heck was Will Buxton wearing a Peanuts branded jacket? The last time I saw a brand that irrelevant in a Formula 1 broadcast, it was the title sponsor of Haas. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. This week, for the poll of the week, I asked, how do you feel about the Las Vegas Grand Prix going forward? And honestly, I'm surprised how few people want to see it removed from the calendar compared to last year. So I guess there's something to be said for learning from your past mistakes and improving the next year. Public sentiment clearly reflects that. And now, back by popular demand, it's the spicy joke of the week. Max Verstappen took his 4th World Championship at the Las Vegas Grand Prix, kicking off a huge night of partying and celebrations for him and race winner George Russell. Max even got a drunken phone call from Daniel Ricciardo, who choked out a "congratulations on the win" between sobs right before giving his toaster a bath.
Was it Hulkenberg's fault? Or is that just a turn one incident that happened?
It kind of looked like he wasn't getting the retardation that he expected under braking.
Oh, don't worry. There was plenty of retardation to go around this weekend. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like the stupidity we witnessed in Qatar. The number of rookie-level errors in the Qatar Grand Prix this weekend was somewhere between surprising and concerning. So let's start with what was surprising and work our way to the concerning ones. Sergio started the surprises on Saturday. And no, I'm not talking about him going out in Q1. That was hardly surprising.
Restart.
I mean when he simply didn't start the sprint race and got passed by actual rookie Franco Colapinto whilst still in the pit lane. A baffled Christian Horner told the press, when the lights go out, you're supposed to go. But what he should have told the press was why Checo still has a job. And then, of course, we have George Russell starting the Grand Prix on pole, which he had to sacrifice his personal relationship with Max Verstappen to secure. But George bungled the start so bad, he lost 2 positions by the first corner, and then watched Verstappen fade into the distance, along with Max's respect for him. Veteran driver and literal male model Nico Hulkenberg had a diarrheal turn 1, losing control of his rear end and shitting all over Colapinto and Ocon's hopes. This brings Williams up to 16 crashes this year, and at this point you have to wonder if Logan Sargent really was that bad, or if it's the car. That is an unreal amount of crashes, and as they say, if everywhere you go smells like shit, check your own shoe. Speaking of Williams, the next rookie mistake I give to Alex Albon for the incident with Stroll. And you might think it was Lance's fault for lacking the skill to control a Formula 1 car after 7 years in the sport, but I lay the blame at Albon's feet because he knew that Lance was going to lose control and still chose to stay that close to him. Frankly, at this point, the only drivers who have any excuse for placing their car anywhere near Lance Stroll on a race start are the young guns who have never raced with him before. Now into the concerning stuff. Let's start with Lewis. Before the Grand Prix even started, Lewis was doubting himself, saying publicly that he isn't fast anymore. And for a guy who literally sold a course on teaching a champion's mindset, you'd think he'd understand the importance of psychology in performance. But then he jumped the start and forgot to put on the pit limiter. Really simple stuff. The sort of basic mistakes you'd expect from a recently divorced dad. And now that I think about it, isn't that kind of what's happening with him leaving his Mercedes family? And then of course there's the stewards, giving Lando an obscenely disproportionate penalty. It's bad enough even without the broader context of McLaren fighting for the constructors, and it brings Leclerc within 8 points of Norris for second place. Maybe Mohammed Ben Sulayem needs to reconsider his strategy of firing people on a whim, especially when there isn't a large talent pool of people with the extremely specific skills required to do those jobs. That brings us to our rookie race director, who clearly had too many responsibilities this weekend. The delayed safety car during the wing mirror incident was mind-boggling, especially when you consider that brand new race director Rui Marquez also had to run the F2 and F1 Academy races. It makes you wonder if Mohammed's been slamming margaritas again. After sacking lead steward Tim Mayer and race director Niels Vidic 3 races before the end of the season, in the midst of a close title fight, I have to wonder if Sulayem's back on the sauce. Because let's be honest, if he isn't drunk on alcohol, he's at least drunk on power. And finally, here to cap off the show, it's the Canadian positivity guy with the spicy joke of the week.
Well, you've heard the British guys enough, so why don't you listen to somebody else for a change?
I wasn't expecting to be reminded of Don Cherry today, but after Tsunoda forced Magnussen wide and Kevin kept his foot into it through the gravel, the F1 TV commentator called it,
"Oh, fruity stuff from K-Mag."
And frankly, for those of you who didn't grow up watching Hockey Night in Canada, I don't expect you to remember when Don Cherry called players who wear visors European fruits. Now, I don't know if fruity means something different over in Europe, but if it means what I think it means, it kind of makes sense. Kevin didn't just bend over and take it from Yuki. He turned around and gave it right back to him. He saw a tight opening and shoved himself right in it. You know what? That's probably enough euphemisms. The Drivers' Championship for 2024 started off looking like a foregone conclusion, but then it got very competitive. But in the end, it turned out exactly as we all expected in the beginning. But the Constructors' Championship was a very different story. Heading into the final race, it felt like a familiar narrative was unfurling. Abu Dhabi started off looking like it was going to be a slam dunk for McLaren, with a front row lockout for the Papaya Boys and Charles Leclerc starting all the way down in 19th. But then, it got very competitive. Let's talk about that. Welcome to the season finale of Race Weekend Update, an F1-themed ripoff of SNL Weekend Update. Abu Dhabi started off with a terrible pun from Crofty.
Right then, let's Abu Dhabi do this, shall we?
But things quickly got serious when Max did an impression of his best friend George Russell and rammed a car in turn 1. With Piastri dropping to the back of the grid and Leclerc propelling himself up to 12th place, suddenly things were looking pretty good for Ferrari. They were only trailing McLaren by 21 points, and with 2 cars potentially scoring, they could do it so long as Norris didn't win. And let's be honest, if there's anyone out there who can blow a pole position, it's first lap Lando. The situation got even worse for McLaren when Piastri decided to apply for Canadian citizenship by rear-ending Colapinto's Williams, earning himself a 10-second penalty and making it that much more difficult for him to get into a scoring position. Leclerc kept climbing up the order and the pressure on Lando to maintain the lead continued to mount, but he wasn't putting a foot wrong. The final battle for the Constructors' Championship was becoming more and more reminiscent of the battle for the Drivers' Championship. The dominant leader who was way ahead suddenly being challenged by a formerly distant second place. It all felt so fitting until the hard tires came on. Lando was pulling a solid 10th per lap on Sainz, but somehow Leclerc was working miracles in his Ferrari, propelling himself all the way up to a podium position. By the end of the race, Hamilton had a champion's drive, rocketing himself up to 4th from 16th, with the beautiful irony being that Leclerc had an even better drive, taking himself from 19th to 3rd, which perfectly sums up Hamilton's final years at Mercedes. No matter what he did, somebody else did it better. After 2 hours of watching Zach Brown bite his nails until they were bloody stumps, Lando pulled it off and won the race, securing the Constructors for McLaren. Frankly, it was a fun race to watch, but after 24 Grand Prix, I am done with this season. So of course they finished off the broadcast by announcing yet another 24 race season. It's all just too much. I adore F1, but it's like icing. I love icing, but I don't want to eat a whole bowl of it. If this season had been shorter, maybe there would have been more hype surrounding the final battles for both championships. But even my group chat full of friends who are into F1 went quiet a couple months ago. We share memes now and then, but nobody seems to be watching the races live anymore. It's becoming a chore. F1 wants to take up nearly half of my weekends every year. And after 3 years of giving up every other Sunday to make a video about each race, I find myself empathizing with all the F1 crew. It's time to cut down the calendar and prioritize quality over quantity. F1 makes a ton of money. They're not hurting financially. And for the first time ever, F1 teams are turning a profit. They can afford to turn down some of the pay tracks, which is what I call all of the terrible street circuits that are only there because they pay to be on the calendar. They're the Lance Stroll of racetracks. I look forward to enjoying the winter break. And next season, you can expect to see me follow my ethos. I will be making fewer, higher quality videos. I'm also going to get back into making F1 parody songs. And if you want to see what those are all about, why don't you watch this one, which is about the time that Lance Stroll broke his wrists. Honestly, it's one of my favorites. I'll see you there.